Greetings and welcome. Welcome to the 2022 Building Performance Symposium. My name is Abbas Amin Mansour, and I have the honor of serving as the chair of the Building Performance Program. This symposium this afternoon may originate from a college town in Midwestern US, but as you will see shortly with the caliber of speakers and others who come on the stage, including Jim, whom I will introduce in a few moments, this is truly a world-class event in terms of our presenters as well as the audience who is online. We have people who have signed up for this from all over the world. So we welcome everyone, regardless of what time zone you're in. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever your time zone is. We're very grateful to these speakers who have accepted our invitation to present and participate in this program today. Jim will come up shortly and talk about introduce the speakers and run the rest of the program. But speaking of program, I do want to take this opportunity and truly thank my good friend, Jim, who has been a true team member in organizing this event with me. So it's been a pleasure to work with you. So thank you very much, Jim. It's interesting that when we talked about selecting speakers, we were all both thinking very similarly. So in terms of topics and individuals, so that was very easy, but he's been tremendously helpful, and I'm very grateful to him. At this point, what I'd like to do is to introduce our school's associate director for graduate programs, Mr. David Cern, who will come and speak and welcome you to the program. I do want to say that our school director, Professor Francisco Rodriguez, would have loved to be here, but unfortunately he was on a flight back to Champaign from a business trip. But we are very delighted that David could join us today. And so without any further ado, we'll turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you, Professor Mansour. I would like to welcome everyone present here today, as well as those joining us via Zoom to this 2022 Building Performance Symposium on the state of the art in design of tall buildings. For those who don't know me, as Professor Mansour said, I'm David J. Isern. I am the new Associate Director for Academic Affairs for the School of Architecture, and I'm new to both the school, the university, and also the state. And coming into this institution, I've seen that the range of events, particularly like this one, that brings great voices from around the country and around the world, it's invigorating. As Professor Mansour also said, I'm extending a welcome on behalf of the director, Francisco Rodriguez, who couldn't be here today, and the entire Illinois School of Architecture community. This symposium today brings together a panel of voices on the design of tall buildings, and we look forward to the conversation ahead. On behalf of the school, I hope this symposium provides a good insight about the design of tall buildings and encourages our students and all those in attendance to engage and challenge the issues of design, building technology, sustainability, climate, population growth that is happening around the world, especially as our student body, the architecture profession, and the people living in the cities where these buildings are being designed and built have become more diverse. Thank you to all the panelists joining us here and from near and far. In particular, I want to thank Professor Abbas-Amin Mansour, Chair of the Building Performance area here at the school, and Professor Jim Parkowski, the Gertrude Land-Curvis Fellow, for organizing this event. And I hope everybody today enjoys the conversation, the discussion, and engage with the panelists as we go. So thank you again for everybody.
Thank you, David. I'd like to take an opportunity to speak with you a little bit about our Building Performance Program, who's the sponsor of this event today. Our School of Architecture consists of a number of programs which are focused mostly at the graduate level. They include building performance, detail and fabrication, health and well-being, history and theory, and urbanism. As I mentioned, today's program is sponsored by the Building Performance Program. We address aspects of overall performance through the integrated design of structural, environmental, enclosure, and related systems. We have a very distinguished list of faculty that you see here in our building performance program, including my friend Jim, who will come up shortly. I'll introduce him as a Purvis Fellow. We're very fortunate to have him on our team for 2 years, and we're delighted that he was able to help us with organizing this event. Areas of teaching and research for our building performance faculty includes environmental systems, structure, construction, comprehensive design, and we do offer courses and seminars in specialized areas that some of our faculty offer as seminars from time to time. As I mentioned, our programs are mostly focused at the graduate level. We do have 2 concentrations that we offer in the building performance program that I'll tell you about in a moment. And we also have a number of joint degree programs, which I will describe to you in just a moment as well. So we have 2 concentrations. These are formal concentrations that go on your transcript as a student. One is the building performance concentration, which is under the Master of Architecture or MArch degree program. That's been in place for a year or 2, very popular. We also have a structures concentration under our Master of Science in Architectural Studies degree program. We do have a number of joint degree programs. One is all of them involve our MArch and MS in Architectural Structures, which is what I mentioned earlier, at structures concentration. We have one with civil engineering in structures, one in civil engineering and construction, and one with master's degree in computer science. And great news, for the first time, we're publicly announcing that we will be offering a certificate in tall buildings for students who will be going through our program. So this is only available to students who are in our program as degree-seeking students. We hope that at some point we'll expand that to other people outside, and you don't have to be a student to join this certificate program. So with that, let me introduce my colleague, Jim Parkowski. As I mentioned earlier, Jim is a longtime friend and a colleague now. I'm delighted to have him on our faculty. Jim is highly, highly regarded and accomplished in the area of tall building design. He was one of major designers of the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, as well as some of the other speakers that you will see later on in a few moments. Jim is also a Purvis Fellow in our program. He's an adjunct faculty with civil engineering, and he serves as the Principal Director of Engineering at Rex Engineering Group. Before that, he was with Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, Chicago office. And perhaps most importantly, Jim is a graduate of our program. So I always, when I talk to people about our structures program, I say, this is what we aim for. This is what we can do. And so, Jim, thank you very much for being on our faculty. Thank you very much for helping us organize this event, and we'll turn the event over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Abbas. That was a very nice introduction. I'm very honored to be part of the faculty here, and I want to thank you, Abbas, as well for all the help with this. This was a great idea. It's going to be a great event. I'm happy to participate and help out how I can. As Abbas mentioned, I joined the faculty here in the fall as a clinical professor and fellow, and I currently teach a class on the design of tall buildings. As Abbas mentioned, I'm a structural engineer, but I am a graduate of the program. And in my career, I was able and fortunate to work on a number of tall buildings, including the Burj Khalifa, as Abbas mentioned. I was also the senior engineer on Europe's tallest building, or it was when it opened, AAA Tower. And I'm excited that many of my colleagues and project team members from Burj Khalifa and other projects I've worked on are participating today. So I want to thank our speakers for being part of this exciting event. I just wanted to say a couple words of introduction. The design of tall buildings, it's an ever-evolving field. We have new design ideas, system and material technologies, analysis techniques, and construction methods that are continually being developed in a truly astounding pace. Almost 25 years ago, the Willis Tower lost the title of the world's tallest building to Petronas. a title that Willis had held for 24 years. However, since losing this title, there have been 21 buildings that have been built even taller. So that's almost an average of one taller building per year. We've designed and are constructing the first kilometer tall tower, and the design of the first mile-high tower is not far behind. The question is no longer how tall can we build, but how tall will we build? Building taller is becoming more efficient and more economical and more desired. This can be seen in the number of tall buildings that we have today. 20 years ago, there were 26 buildings over 300 meters tall, the typical measure of what we call a super tall building. Today, there are over 200. So we have a great slate of presentations today from a group of true experts in tall building design. We will explore topics related to the state of the art in many facets of tall building design: core organization and design, construction, wind engineering, elevatoring, and sustainability. After our presentations conclude, we will have a panel discussion to go over some additional topics and any questions that may have arisen during the presentations. So I invite everybody to stay through the end. That's a very exciting discussion. A couple bookkeeping notes. If you have a question for our speaker, please enter it in the chat. We'll get to as many as we can. And we also have the panel discussion at the end. Just a brief intro into the schedule. We're going to have 2 presentations, then a short break. Then we'll conclude the symposium with 3 additional presentations in our panel discussion. And finally, I just want to make sure everybody is aware that this presentation, this symposium, is eligible for AAA credit. If you desire the credit, please send information to Spring Harrison. The email address is here. We will be distributing this information by email to everybody who's attending, so don't feel like you have to write it all down. But again, if you're interested in AIA credit, there is a way to obtain that as well. So with that, I'd like to get into our presentations and introduce our first speaker, Peter Weissmantel. So Peter is the Managing Director of Peter Weissmantel, LLC, Consulting Director, Super Tall Building Technology at Adrian Smith and Gordon Gill Architecture, and formerly an Associate Partner at Skidmore, Owings & Merrill in Chicago. He has been responsible for the technical design and coordination of systems including vertical transportation, fire and life safety, and the building facade on projects including Broadgate, Ludgate, and Canary Wharf developments in London, Jin Mao Tower in Shanghai, and the world's tallest building, Burj Khalifa in Dubai. Projects currently under construction include Al Wasi and Uptown Dubai Tower in Dubai, Wuhan Greenland Center and the Greenland Dongkun Center in China, and the Jeddah Tower, formerly known as Kingdom Tower, in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, which when completed, will be the first building in the world to be more than 1,000 meters in height. Peter is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects, the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat, and the Facade Tectonics Institute. He is the past chairman of the Chicago Committee on High-Rise Buildings, past president of the Safety Glazing Certification Council, past chairman of the Height Committee, and member of the Advisory Committee on the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat, member of the Otis Elevator Customer Advisory Board, the National Fire Prevention Association's High-Rise Building Safety Advisory Committee, and a founding member of the Board of Directors of the Facade Tectonics Institute. Peter, thank you for participating today, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I'm sharing my screen. I think you guys have to control that. You have to turn that on. Nope.
Okay, why don't you try now?
Okay, we'll try this again. Okay. Okay, what do you see?
So we see presentation mode.
Okay, that's I had this all set up before. That's why we need to practice. Let's see. Okay, one more time. Maybe this is still presentation mode.
It's still presentation mode.
Okay, yeah, okay, hold on. That one?
Yes, now works.
All right. I need Ahmed here to help me through this. Anyway, I'm very pleased to be here, especially with good friends and some new acquaintances. My name is Peter Weissmantel. I am, let's see if that works. Okay. I am, as Jim said, managing director of Peter Weissmantel LLC, which basically means I retired a couple of years ago. I'm still consulting director of super tall building technology at Adrian Smith and Gordon Gill. And then I'm still doing that because I just love that title so much. I'm going to talk about the core. And the title of this talk was suggested by Carol Willis, who's the founder and director of the Skyscraper Museum in New York City. And a more complete version of this talk is actually on YouTube somewhere, if you can find it. Anyway, the idea that the core is in the heart of the tall building, and it combines, it's an architectural technical Swiss watch, if you will, that allows the building to function, but also provides a lot of other facilities. So there is when you talk about the core, there are kind of two primary elements. There's the structural core, which is the spine or the backbone of the building, and then there is the architectural core. And I call the architectural core actually is more than architectural. It's everything that allows the building to function. The architectural core consists of elevators, stairs, MEP rooms, service risers, etc., that are contained within the structural shell of the structural core. And whenever you talk about architecture, you always have to pull in the three Vitruvian principles, which are firmness, commodity, and delight. This was principles that were set forth in the 1st century AD by a Roman architect that wrote the first treatise on architecture. So when you talk about the core, firmness is pretty obvious. Strength. It's what allows the building to stand up, basically. And stand up, it's not just gravity, because it actually has a lot to do with the fact that a tall building, especially a super tall, is really a design of a cantilever, like a beam stuck in the ground. And so these images show the three modes of translation that every tall building needs to withstand with respect to lateral forces and wind and seismic. And so the core is really is the primary element that withstands those in the current crop of super talls. Commodity is functionality, and that includes things, as you can see, elements in the core here, things like the exit stairs and the service elevators and the toilet rooms and the fan rooms. That this construct allows the building to function, but also there is, that's its utility. There's also delight in the core, and delight is another word for beauty. And I really love this image, because this is an image of Jin Mao under construction, because I think it shows really not only the strength, but the fact that this is a beautiful structure in and of itself. And it can be even made more beautiful by adding an element of surprise. So this is actually a view of the Jin Mao core, the top 38 floors of the building, where the architectural elements have been evacuated. And what's left is the core structure rung by the balconies that connect all the hotel rooms in the Grand Hyatt in Shanghai. That's in the top of Jin Mao. So it ticks off all three Vitruvian principles in my mind. But we're talking about the primacy of the center core, and the primacy of the center core in the current typology is really, it's something that's not even debatable. As of all of the 58 super tall buildings taller than the Empire State Building that have been constructed to date, basically have a center core. Not that there aren't other typologies. There are other. They're not. The center core is not the only way to go. There are reasons that the core might not be in the center of the building. So, for instance, you might offset the core, and this is an example. Central Park Tower, where the core is to the southeast here of the floor plate, so that there can be unencumbered views of Central Park and Central Park West to the north of the tower. The core also could be offset for reasons of climate. And so this is Alhambra, an SOM project that is in the Middle East, and the core is set to the south because really, you know, you want to protect the occupants from the harsh sun. There's also reasons to offset the core for things like site constraints. So this is a 425 Park Avenue. I think it's a Foster's project. The position on the site didn't allow for the core to be centered because of the thinness of the site. So it was offset to the bottom of the page. And then offset cores can also occur for other reasons, like special use floor plates. This is 122 Leadenhall in London, which has at the bottom of the building functions, allows for the function of large trading floors, unencumbered spaces for you know, the Morgan Stanleys of the world. So the core was offset to give these wonderful large spaces at the bottom of the building, and at the top, it obviously stays offset at the top, but then it has a much slenderer floor plate. There's also something we call single ed cores with satellites. This is a project in Philadelphia, another Foster's building, where the core is at the end, and the reason it's at the end is because there are magnificent views in the north, west, and south directions, whereas the view to the east was not that good. There's also double-ended cores, where the cores are offset entirely to provide, for instance, to provide two separate sets of entries for functions. In this case, this is Index Tower, where there's a residential function above an office function. So you have two completely separate cores with two completely separate entries. But let's go back to the center core. Again, I said the primacy of the center core, and why is that? I think it ends up in the center because for reasons of optimization and serendipity. It's the optimal structural location. It's the optimal location for occupant circulation. It's the optimal location for services distribution, as well as it allows for a consistent perimeter and maximum perimeter lease span. It's also an optimal location for unencumbered views. Furthermore, the serendipity part has to do with the structure. The constructability using reinforced concrete in the center of the building allows for greatest flexibility. It allows for the use of climbing formwork, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And also the fact that the core, being a very robust and thick-walled structure, in some cases, we're going to talk specifically about a project in China that is nearing completion called Chengdu. In some cases, the perimeter walls of this core are over 1 meter thick. So it's a wonderful place. Well, it's a great place. It's very robust, and it's a great secure place to put things like exit stairs, to put your riser shafts, especially for your fire life safety systems, in very protected positions, very, very secure positions. With the primacy of the center core, I'll go back a little bit on my history. Jin Mao Office Tower, which was completed, Jin Mao Tower, which was completed in 1999, was arguably one of the first of we'll call the prototype of this new typology, center core, happens to be a core and outrigger structure. So you can see the octagonal core in the center. The outrigger trusses are not shown, but they're along the lines of these mega columns here. They're very large composite mega columns, and it formed it kind of exemplifies this new typology that has become more or less, as I said, the dominant typology for super tall buildings over 380 meters. This is a plan of that hotel zone I had the photograph of earlier. And so you can see the core, the structural core still exists, carried on. It's now, the walls are a little thinner, but the whole center of the core has been evacuated. And the architectural core now occurs in various locations. So there's an architectural satellite core to the north that contains exit stairs, areas of refuge, service elevators. There's small satellite cores with another set of exit stairs in this location. And then all those mechanical things have ended up being distributed in risers that relate to the primary use of this portion of the building, the hotel. So the risers basically serve the hotel guest rooms. So that being the new prototype, and this is again a view of that atrium as you've seen before. So primacy, the center core, programmatically, structurally, functionally is in the center. And what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the programmatic elements of a typical mixed-use super tall building using Chengdu Greenland Tower as the example. So where do you start? You start, even though the core is a major plan element, you actually start in section. The Chengdu is really a prototypical super tall building, mixed use with approximately 120,000 square meters of office at the base of the building, this blue zone here, about 50,000 square meters of residential in this intermediate zone, with a hotel of about 48,000 square meters. And then at the very top, there's an observatory assembly space that we call the Sky Club at the very top in the crown of the building. This tower is nearing completion, as I mentioned, in Chengdu, China. It's 468 meters tall, which puts it even taller than Jin Mao, but it's still well down the list of tallest buildings in the world these days. So in the core itself, what are the elements that are shared by all super tall building types? First of all, occupant elevators. That's probably the most obvious. The occupant elevators and elevator lobbies, but also there's a whole set of elevators that serve for firefighting, for service, for freight, and for the kind of, I'll call it the back of house functions of a tower. There's also exit stairs with landings and vestibules. There's also the MEP service risers and rooms, which include, very importantly, the smoke control, pressurization, and extract duct risers that allow the exit stairs in these very tall buildings to be free of smoke should they be needed. So in looking at that in plan, all these common elements also have unique elements for each functional zone of the tower. So in the office zone, for instance, you will have the toilet rooms and associated risers that allow those to function. You'll have on-floor fan rooms and or central plant space to serve the environmental needs of the floor. There'll be supplemental satellite or tenant risers that allow functions on the floor to connect into services, and that's in these kind of blue spaces here. And then there'll be soft spots for future service risers or vertical connections to allow for the interconnection between floors and to allow for flexibility in office space use. Within the residential zone, you'll notice that the core has started to clear out. And that's one of the keys to most of the super talls that you see that are being built today. The residential use is a lot less elevator centric. It's a lot less vertical transportation reliant. It's also a lot less environmental reliant because you don't have as many people on the floor. So you'll see the core has cleared out because all of the office elevators have disappeared. And the only addition, and even the service rooms have become much less of a factor here because there's a lot less necessity for environmental control in the residential area. So what has replaced some of those elements in the open space are things like trash and recycling chutes, tenant storage and amenity spaces to allow for the residential occupants to get more utility. And then of course now what occurs is the residential elevators have now continued. And of course, still in the center are some of those shared elements, the exit stairs, the service elevators, et cetera. As we continue up the building, we get to the hotel zone. Now, the hotel zone, you can see several things have happened now. The core still exists, the structural core still exists, but it's now become the corridor to the hotel rooms around the perimeter. Or it's now become the corridor wall, I should say. The corridor now for the hotel, serving the hotel rooms, is now inside the core. So the structural core still exists, but the architectural core has now shrunk down to be as minimal as possible. Now you remember the owner of the building, our client, is making money from the area of the building that he can lease. So the smaller we can make the core, the more space is left over for the actual revenue producing uses of the building. So what are the unique elements to serve the hospitality of the hotel? Well, first of all, it's a dedicated hotel service elevators and lobbies, and those are actually in this zone. The housekeeping rooms and service in the back of house storage and workspaces, and that's in this kind of pinkish area. And you also have things like laundry chutes and linen chutes and things like that, which usually are in the housekeeping areas. So we're now one stage left from the top of the building where the center core then is at its minimal. The architectural core, I should say, and even the structural core has now been reduced to basically a small box of cruciform rooms, cruciform walls that enclose the minimum architecture, the minimum structural space required to provide that lateral stiffness that we talked about. And the unique elements that are left to serve the observation and assembly are high-speed shuttle elevators, which in this case are this group of elevators in this location, and then those common elements that we had before, the exit stairs, the service elevators, and some mechanical electrical spaces that serve the floor. So how do we do this? So the center core does something that is important. The design and transformation of the center core is what allows the building to maintain its functionality and maintain its economic viability. So what determines the ability to transfer and to transform the core from a very large element at the bottom to a very compact element at the top? Well, first, the determining factors in designing the core starts with the shape of the floor plate, and of course the mixed use of functional group stacking of the program, vertical transportation, elevator grouping, that drops off by zones, and then codes, the fire, life safety, and codes, which include means of escape and firefighting access. So when we talk about shape of the floor plate, you start with the art, the architectural design vision is an idea that generally forms from the outside in. So when we talk about the shape of the core has to correspond to the shape of the floor plate. And so these are a couple of examples, some projects that we've recently worked on. This is actually Chengdu again, and you can see the faceted kind of octagonal side, and we'll show you this in a little more detail because the building is very interesting. It tapers and it's faceted and such. This is another project that basically has a triangular form. Hence the core ends up being more or less like a triangle. Remember, because we want to keep the least span, that is, the least span is the distance from the core wall to the perimeter exterior wall of the building. Want to maximize that least span and keep it as consistent as possible. And in this case, this is kind of a lozenge shape where the architectural and the structural core correspond to the shape of the building. Examples you saw previously, this is Jin Mao at the bottom of that, or this is a Jin Mao-like core, where at the bottom the building is actually more or less square. This is a circular core, again, hence because of the shape of the tower floor plate. And then of course your kind of bog standard, very traditional rectangular core. Last but not least, we get into some very unique shapes. And of course, building on the left, octagonal core, which is a variation of the square core. The building in the middle is a three-winged core. It's a kind of a triangle, but it's really more like a tripod. And then the building on the right is a tripod, fully a tripod, which happens to be the Jeddah Tower floor plate. How the core and due to its height, I'm not going to go into too much detail on Jeddah Tower today, but due to its height, very much the core and the wing structure very much are integrated. So let's go back to the mixed use elements, and I'm going to be talking a lot about Chengdu as I finish up my talk here. So remember, office, hotel, residential, and observatory or assembly at the top, the tower club. The next element that we talked about that determines how you can transform the core is perhaps the most important element. And I know Javier is going to be talking about breaking some ground in some new technology that's being developed for elevators. But I being living in the present and having to get these things built, we still have certain limitations with respect to elevators, such as and having to do with maybe one or maximum two cabs in a shaft. The height is an issue. When we were doing Burj Khalifa, we designed the tallest elevators in the world at 508 meters. And now we can significantly go higher than that due to rope technology and other things that have been developed. And then I think Javier is going to give us a glimpse of the future with respect to maybe some very interesting ropeless technologies. But anyway, this is the functional and stacking diagram and what we call the vertical transportation diagram of Chengdu Greenland Tower. The blue area is the offices, green is residential, and then the orangey area is the hotel. And the first thing you'll notice is there are a lot more elevators. If you can see this, you can't really see it too well, but if you can see the number of shafts and the number of elevators serving the office, there are a lot more elevators. And the reason for that is that in an office type occupancy, most people come in at the same time in the morning, and they go to lunch at the same time in midday, and they leave more or less at the same time in the evening. So you have to have a significant amount of elevators in order to serve that synchronous functioning. The residential, you'll notice there's fewer elevators, but also we've introduced, and we even introduced, because of the capacities, introduced sky lobbies into the design. And that is, a sky lobby is served by high-speed shuttle elevators and it's a point where the transitions occur, and you transfer, an occupant will transfer from a high-speed shuttle to a lower speed local. And then for the very top of the building, the hotel itself has another sky lobby, and its lobby and amenity floors at the bottom of the hotel stack, and then a series of elevators that serve the hotel and the club observatory level above. So the vertical the vertical stacking, the vertical transportation diagram is very important document, because it makes sure that we're meeting the design criteria, the handling capacity, and all the other things that people expect, that occupants expect in the use of the building, so as to not be to be unencumbered, and so to have the functionality of the building work properly. So looking at what that means in the design of the core and the transformation, going from right to left here, this is more or less the high-rise, the office shuttle floor plans, where the high-speed shuttles come in and serve the buildings. The residential shuttles are on this side of the core, and they transfer to the residential locals, and the hotel shuttles have, the high-speed shuttles transfer from the high-speed shuttles to the hotel locals at this floor, and then the Sky Club shuttles actually serve all the way from the ground floor. There's also other local transfers that are illustrated, where in each, I'll actually go back a little bit here, just so you'll notice, each of these stacks of elevators allow for interconnections within uses. So at the top of each of these stacks, there's actually a transfer point that allows one local group to join to an occupant from one local group to join another, so that within their zone of the building, they can transfer, so that they don't have to go back down to the lobby to allow them to do this. But again, as you notice, as you go up in the building, you have less elevators and less encumbered space. Also, another element that's during transitions is the building services, the mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and fire protection programmatic elements. And those elements consist of risers that generally go vertical, like elevators, but then they also consist of horizontal distribution. And so you can see the MEP spaces, which are in these multicolors. You can see how they start fairly large at the bottom of the building, again, because of the loads that office has compared to residential and to hotel, till at the very top of the building, you really just have a minimal amount of stuff. But now, many of you are structural engineers. How does that affect the structure? And the structural core actually transforms just like the architectural core transforms. And again, in a mixed use building, we have the opportunity to really drop off a lot of stuff as the building goes up. And so you can see the primary shear walls or structural walls of the core as you go up the building become, not only, you can't really see this, they not only become smaller, the footprint becomes smaller, but the walls become thinner in an optimization process. And so this diagram on the right shows the actual core. The middle image are the mega columns, and then all together the whole assembly, because this is an outrigger and a core and outrigger building, shows how the outrigger trusses connect the mega columns to the structural core. A reminder again that the outrigger trusses are connecting through the occupied space to the core, And these are the locations. And so what do we do? Those outrigger trusses, as you could see from the previous image, are pretty hefty structure. So we actually then do another stacking dance, if you will, and we insert the MEP floors that are required periodically up the height of the building to coincide more or less with the outrigger trusses, so that these kind of encumbered floors are not lost for use. And it's important, you have to stack the MEP floors in the same, for the same reason you need to transfer elevators, because the reach of the MEP services is somewhat limited. If you think about it, if you had a pipe filled with water that was 468 meters tall, you would have a hard time handling the pressure at the bottom. So we break up the building more or less into roughly 40-story increments to allow for a reasonably sized mechanical system. The other element that we need to think about in the transformation has to do with I said building services, but fire, life safety, and codes, specifically means of escape and firefighting access. And my primary firefighting access is by the firefighting elevators, and which in the case of most buildings in the world these days connect up to areas of refuge, which is a whole nother discussion that I'm not going to have time to talk about today. And then there's a connection with the means of escape stairs. So the means of escape stairs always are continuous from the top to the bottom of the building, but they are interrupted, I will say, at areas of refuge that have to do with places where the stack effect can be broken, and also access to the lifeboat elevators, which we're starting to use these days. So I think I'm going to finish up here real quickly, just to run through the Chengdu core configuration and floor plate footprint configuration. So you can see the perimeter of the Chengdu is more or less an octagon, but it's a 16-sided octagon. It's a faceted, tapered building. So as we go up the building, so we go up to the first office zone, the second office zone, and as if you can start to see the building perimeter changes, and the elements in the core, as the elevators drop out, start to change. And then we will come to a point where you'll see more elevators in the core, because what happens is the sky lobby shuttles drop off, and then we pick up the locals that serve the high-rise zone of the office. And then, as you may notice, the core walls start to get thinner. The elements again start to change. We're now in the residential, so you can see we've evacuated a lot of the services from the core, replaced them with elements, and now we've entered the hotel zone at the amenity levels, and the hotel local elevators pick up because you've transferred from the shuttles, the hotel shuttles. And then this is where the outline of the core changes radically. The structural core walls have now thinned up very much. The corridor that serves the hotel guest rooms is now inside the core, and the inner cross, the cruciform walls are showing up in the inner core, which at the very top of the building, at the sky lob of the building, allows for the minimal structural core, the minimal architectural core, and the maximal, because they make a lot of money from these spaces, the maximum sky lobby. So just to finish up, constructability, when we were doing Jin Mao, this is a photograph from 1995. The climbing formwork was kind of in its infancy. Had been started to be developed for things like cooling towers on power plants and such, and it was being applied in such a way so that by 2005 at Burj Khalifa, we really called it a climbing factory, where it actually consisted of 3 levels of activity. At the very top, they would be placing the rebar cages. At the middle level, they'd be pouring the concrete. And at the bottom level, these you can see these jacks are in place, but they'd actually be placing things like the elevator guide rails and such, so that as the building increased in height, as the core increased in height, there was actually this really little climbing factory that was building the core. And now I love this image because this is Chengdu under construction. You can see the octagonal core, and now they've actually incorporated the climbing tower cranes. The tower cranes are actually on a platform above the climbing factory, and I think it was very comprehensive view and integrated use of the climbing form. And now these days we're now even seeing things such as robotics are being introduced into the system. By Schindler has this robotic installation system for elevator guide rails and such that are happening down. Just to finish up, the center core has other variations, a little less simple, such as cruciform shear walls, but the center core is still can be discernible. Obviously, you can have cores, center cores in round buildings with satellite cores so that the center core is minimalized. You can also visually express the core. This was a project that was called Las Vegas Tower. That it was meant to be the world's tallest building at the time, but the actual structure is like an exoskeleton, and it was expressed as the structural element in the center of the building. There's core walls that do it all. I like to say this shear wall tower, Salesforce Tower in San Francisco. You notice the one thing that's really striking is how small the perimeter columns are, because this is not a core and outrigger building. This is a core building with no perimeter outriggers, no perimeter mega columns nor outriggers. The core is doing all the work. And in San Francisco, that's kind of a major accomplishment because it is a fairly high seismic zone. But then again, there could be the all steel. You know, we don't do buildings in steel anymore, hardly. But this is a all steel super tall. It's hard to say, with central core, steel braced central core. And then there's of course the classic buttress core of Burj Khalifa, and now starting with that at the starting point. We have, I guess, the shear walls and buttress core. My friend Bob Sin would call this a shear wall building, but I call it a combo because the core shape is definitely buttressed by the shear walls that reach out to the ends of each wing. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for the time that you've given me. And I hope you've enjoyed the show. And if there are questions, I look forward to answering them. How'd we do time-wise?
We're perfect, Peter. Thank you. Thank you for a great presentation. Are there any, we have time for a couple of questions. If anybody has a question, want to put it in the chat. I guess one question I have for you, Peter, you know, you mentioned so many different components to the core. You know, it really is a Swiss watch. What's the most challenging part of it all, besides just trying to fit everything into as small a space as possible?
You know, I've said this before. We don't design a core; we negotiate a core. And in a super tall building, you know, obviously, well, Jim, you're a structural engineer, and Ahmed, you're a structural engineer. But face it, the structure is kind of the most important element, at least from a safety standpoint. So you know, we as architects tend to defer a lot to the structure. We I think the most challenging element is I'll call it the dance of the elevators, because we do have the constraints, you know, using current technology. Of you know, height and capacity and speed and number of occupants, etc. So the elevators are probably, in my opinion, the toughest thing to design, because they will certainly dictate the geometry and kind of the limits of the footprint. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
No, it does. And I know it was a loaded question. I know everything's very challenging with the core. So I like your phrase about negotiating the core. That's perfect. Again, if there's any questions that anybody else may have, you can put it in the chat and we can revisit this discussion with Peter when we get to the panel discussion. Peter, again, thank you. So we'll move on to our next presenter. So another friend and former colleague that I'm happy is participating, Ahmed Abdalrazak. He is a structural engineer and earned his bachelor's and master's in civil engineering from the University of Texas and presently Ahmed is the founder and managing director and partner of Rise Global LLC, a firm that is specialized in all aspects of engineering and management works for large and complex development projects where added value to the overall performance of the project is required, including but not limited to structural engineering, value engineering, buildability, pre-construction services, construction planning, and overall management for large and complex development projects. Ahmed formerly served as the executive vice president with Samsung C&T in Seoul, Korea, and held several key technical and management positions during his tenure there, including heading the high-rise and complex building division. During his tenure at Samsung, Ahmed contributed to the transition the international building division from construction-only provider to the successful design build, pre-construction, value engineering, and fast-track construction service. He has been involved in the design and construction planning of several Korean and international projects, including Samsung headquarters office, the proposed 151-story Incheon Tower, 360 West, Mumbai, and Tanjong Pagar in Singapore. He has also held operational positions as executive project director for Lakta Center in St. Petersburg and the Merdeka 118 Tower in Malaysia, which we're going to hear a little bit more about today. Ahmed spent the first half of his career at SOM, where as an associate partner, he worked on the structural design of Hotel de Art in Barcelona, Jin Mao Tower Palace 3, where he was my first boss on a high-rise project, which was a great experience. I'll always remember. Burj Khalifa, Millennium Park Project, and among many others. Since 2005, Ahmed is a visiting professor at Seoul National University, and he's previously served as an adjunct professor at IIT. And recently, he was also selected as a member of the National Academy of Engineering. Ahmed, thank you for joining us today, and I'll turn the screen over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jim, for the nice introduction. It's been a really long time since I've been in the US. Spent almost half of my career in Korea and in overseas project. And definitely, it's nice to be back. And today, I think I will be speaking a little bit about the second tallest building in the world, which is the Merdeka 118 in KL, Malaysia. Again, this project, I was one of those fortunate people who had been able to work on Burj Khalifa, which is now the tallest, and the Merdeka 118, which is the second tallest, and the tallest in Europe, which is the Lakta Center, which is also another challenging project. So today, my talk will be really very much focused on the structural engineering challenges of this project, and also utilization of concrete technology for super tall building and what it means. So as most of you know, probably this project in November has been announced its final height, which is about 678 meters. To become the tallest building in the world, almost regained Malaysia when it became the tallest building in Malaysia. Again, this project will definitely change the KL skyline, and its location is one of those prominent locations. As you can see, it's surrounded by a prominent site including the Negara Stadium and also Merdeka Stadium, which have very big significance to Malaysia. And probably some of you may know, one of the projects that SOM was involved with is Plaza Rakyat, which is right here, that have been there for a long time. But this area is up and coming, and it's becoming the third center in KL. These are some of the images that you see of the project. That includes both the KL 118, the KL Tower, and also the Vitruvian Tower that you spoke about. Again, in Malaysia, again, we can talk a lot about. This is one when Vitruvian Tower was the tallest building in the world for about 24 years, and now is surpassed by the Merdeka 118. Again, experience from the tallest, we have Burj Khalifa, Merdeka 118, and this is during Samsung been able to work on these three major projects, which are some of the tallest. Now today, the project essentially is the developer is BNP, which is National Capital Corporation, and it's National Investment Corporation of Malaysia, which is more or less like a sovereign fund. And they wanted to consolidate their offices at their single headquarter office in this prominent location. And the contract administrator on this project was Turner International. And this project, again, it involves both international and local architect and engineers. For architect, FKA out of Australia was the major design architect, international architect, and RSP is the local engineer, local architect of record. The civil and structure, the design initially developed by Lera out of the US, and Arab were the local structural engineer and civil engineer record. And also for mechanical engineering, Lera out of the US, and KTA was a local MEP company. The contractor of this project, it's Samsung C&T in collaboration with UEM Builders, which is a local contractor in Malaysia. The project essentially consists of office from level 8 up to level 97. And then from 97 to the top of the building to about 112, we have hotel, apartment suites, and it's Park Hyatt. And from 113 to 118, we have the sky decks, the restaurants, VIPs, and also the observation deck. And today, I believe the sky deck would be the tallest sky deck in the world. Again, this project, as I mentioned, is located in a prominent location, and what we call in Malaysia as the Golden Triangle, where we have the Vitruvian Tower, Merdeka 118 here, and the KL Tower. This area is near Chinatown, which is being gentrified, and it's being up and coming. As you can see, the site location when we started the project, essentially it was just nothing in there, but surrounded by two prominent sites, as I mentioned, which is the stadium here. Now, the site location in particular, initially it was very, very highly congested. There's a lot of schools, narrow streets, and in order to make this project realized, definitely the client, BNP, had to invest a lot of the infrastructure to improve the overall accessibility to the site, and also the traffic situations, including investing in MRT stations, mass transportations, a lot of traffic analysis that has been done to make sure that the site can accommodate these stadia and also this big development that the client is proposing. Again, the site is very well connected. We have LRT lines, KL monorail, and so on and so forth. Now, also from a traffic circulation, as I mentioned, this was very highly congested area from a traffic standpoint. So the client has spent put a lot of investment in improving the overall assessment and access to the site at multiple level. We expected about in the base of the building, we added almost 100 parking parking spaces. Now, the tower itself is a very large development, and it has to be really integrated by this prominent site, which is including the Stadium Nagara and also the Stadium Merdeka. And the architect made an effort in order to integrate the site, which consists of, as I mentioned, 118-story office tower and hotel. And then also to the east, we have two high-rise residential tower and one residential tower to the east. And also we had a very big retail plan. The green part here, what you will see here is this is a promenade in which it allows access to the Merdeka, an integrated part of the site, and also open to the public use. The architectural design concept of the tower is very much influenced by a mixture of diamond shapes derived from traditional Malaysian Songket pattern to signify the diversity of the Malaysian people. And the spire itself is a symbolic image and a silhouette of Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman raising his hand and chanting Merdeka, which means to declare independence of Malaysia at that time. And now, in terms of our involvement in the project, I was working with Samsung and we bid on the project. And essentially what you see the area in red is our scope of work. We need to build this entire area, which include piling works for the podium, not the tower, tower structure, and then also the entire parking garage, which is about 236,000 square meter. The overall site area is about 76,000 square meter. And the facade, the architectural trades, water features, and all the MEP work, they were all, especially the MEP and architectural packages, were all nominated subcontractors. And one of the interesting things about the site, as you can see, is surrounded by essential facilities in which we have deep basements around the entire site. And we have a shallow foundation. These stadia are located, which impose a huge amount of demand in terms of the amount of movement that we can tolerate. And also it's surrounded by MRT stations just around the site. So this, to manage the site during construction and to manage the movement for this essential facility was one of the most challenging things during construction. The blue part, what you will see here, the other complexity of the project is Samsung UEM scope, and then the one in green by another contractor, which is Hamazaki, and then also we have a third contractor was also involved, and a fourth contractor that was involved in building the retail. So in terms of managing all of these and coordinating all these, we are in the middle of everything. The work was in itself extremely challenging. I spent about 2.5 years full-time on the site to ensure that everything was fully coordinated and executed without any kind of hiccups. And also, as I mentioned earlier, the managing of the movement was extremely critical of the site. Now, progress of the construction, as you can see here, as of October, before we lifted it, the spire and the preparation to do the final lift, this is what the project looked like. And in December in 2021, again, this is what you see here. And in January, essentially the spire was completely lifted, and this is what the building looked like today. Now, how the project is started, obviously, the client selected FKA as being the design architect, and they proposed many different schemes for this project, as you can see. But finally, the client selected the diamond kind of shape of or parallelogram kind of shape, which is not architecturally is okay, but from a structural standpoint, it has its own challenges. And this is what the final thing looked like, which I'll speak about, especially related to the wind engineering aspects. So for this particular project, if you look at it from a structural standpoint, if the wind is blowing in this direction, you would see that the neutral axis of the building is here, right? And so essentially we didn't have necessarily a lot of depth. But also when you look at this building and the shape, you think the first thing impression that you have, there's a lot of variation in the shape of the building, which means that from wind engineering standpoint is going to perform not too bad. However, the indentation of these elements were not large enough. In fact, they aggravated the wind effects. So when the wind is blowing in this direction, it's acting like a foil in which the crosswind response was extremely critical, more than what is expected, and it was resulted in forces even bigger than a similar building in a more severe wind environment. KL is a very benign wind conditions. As you can see here, the basic wind speed at Merdeka or in KL is about 35 meters per second. But if you look at Shanghai or Seoul or Busan, and we look at a building of this size, essentially the magnitude of the base overturning moment and the shear were very much less than what we had in Merdeka, and that was the results of the crosswind response and the dynamic excitation that the building received. But another challenging aspect of this project, the core, as Peter mentioned, it follows the shape of the building, which makes sense to maximize the lease span. And what you will see here that the effective use of the material is really AD squared, as you can see, is only few elements that essentially really participate and contribute significantly to the moment of inertia of the building. So that was created a big challenge for the structural engineer related to some of these mega columns that I will speak about. And if you look at the Sewell number for this particular building, I would say it's just for a square, you'll be around 0.12. And if you look at this building in particular, you could be as high as 0.16, maybe even higher. So it wasn't necessarily dynamically a very good shape. The other thing is in terms of the directionality of the wind, the orientation of the tower was also in the worst wind direction. And because of how they located the tower relative to the stadia, they couldn't really change the orientation of it. So it got hit in that direction too. But anyway, regardless, this building is sitting in a very low seismic. There is no seismic record, but however, Indonesia is nearby, so there's far earthquake that we needed to deal with. But for all practical purposes, this building was controlled again by wind effects. From acceleration standpoint, through managing the stiffness of the building acceleration was within acceptable limit. And the building mode shapes was about 12 seconds and 11.13 seconds in the other direction, and torsionally it's about 3.93. Now, some of the challenging aspects of this project, essentially the project is founded in 138 port piles that are roughly on a 4-meter raft, and also we have 8 mega columns, but the core wall has what we call is the hammerhead here, which is a very, very large, massive element, which which is 7.4 meter by 4.3 meter big. So it's big, massive concrete. And also the outer, the mega columns are pretty big. They go up to 4.3 to meter in size. The other thing is the outrigger, and we have also a lot of transfers between the outrigger small column that I will speak about, but also the top of the building, we have the spire that is very thin and which very difficult to reach by crane, in which we have to do special lifting for this particular system. The structural system of the tower essentially consists of the center core that is linked with outrigger at the 3 different levels, from level 40 to 43, from 75 to 78, and 113 to 116. And then on the weak, that's both in the strong and the weak axis. And then in between, what you see here is this red column. Essentially, we have that transfer every every 17 floors or so. So what we have is intermediate belt walls that allows for the intermediate steel column to transfer around the pyramid in these belt trusses. So this in itself created another challenge. As you can see from this diagram here, you have the core, you have the mega column, and then you have the intermediate steel beam that are very small. So the differential shortening and managing the levelness of the floor become a challenge by itself, and how we manage that. So anyway, as I mentioned earlier, the building was controlled by stiffness, and the initial use of the material was 7085, which is the maximum that can use in Malaysia around the Tronas Tower days, and it goes to about C16 the core. And for the mega columns, we had 85, 80, 70, and 60. And in order to make up for the stiffness, because these column need to be really, really big, in which it became the mega column impractical, in which the structural engineers decided to use a lot of rebar, up to about 4% to 5% of rebar, to add stiffness, not necessarily for strength, which makes the constructability aspects of these elements. You would have like more than 2,000 D40 rebar in one column in one location, which makes it very difficult to build, and the constructability aspect was very critical. So, which I will speak a little bit about. So in order to overcome this, we introduce a new concrete, which is we call C105, which is a maximum concrete can be used not only necessarily for strength, but also for stiffness, in which we also introduce a new type of aggregate with high stiffness concrete in order to reduce the rebar to more manageable level, which is within 1.5%. And that resulted in a huge amount of cost saving for this project, more than 14,000 tons of rebar, and also allowed us to reduce the wall thickness from 1.7 meter to around 1.2 meter in many areas. So more or less, we added 2,500 lettable space to the building without changing the stiffness of this project. This is here kind of give you an illustration of the lateral system again. So we have the core, we have what we call is the hammerhead, which is massive element, the mega columns. And in between, you can see these very thin structural steel element that transfer at the belt trusses here, what in between the mega columns. And again, so that's essentially what the overall arrangement of the lateral system look like. This is just kind of unfolded a view that shows the east-west structural section with the outrigger in the east-west direction and the north-south direction. So what we will see here is, even though they are not in the north-south direction, the core wall was really big enough. We didn't need we eliminated one of the outrigger because the core itself was good enough. This is just here another view of the structural system. This is what the unfolded view of the parameter of the building look like. As you can see, it's a pretty complicated. The green line is where the outrigger is, and all the red lines indicate where the structural steel members are. So managing the differential movement in these elements that could have impact on the facade and the levelness of the floor was extremely critical. And this is here looking at the view from the outside relative to the spire. Again, the outrigger are really very massive elements, as you can see here. This is the scale of a person to the size of these structural member that are built up to steel plate. Initially, the original design was 2 plate. It was very difficult to manage, so I replaced it with a single plate here to improve the constructability and rebar arrangement of this. This is just to give you an order of magnitude of the scale. When we redesigned initially, the structural engineer required these elements to be casting. With these big size element, as you can see, is really very difficult to do such a casting without having too many things to worry about. So we essentially suggested an alternative design where we made that out of structures built up steel elements. Looking at the scale of this, this is a person, and that gives you an order of magnitude of the size of some of these outrigger, which is about 2.2 meter by about 1.2 meter wide here. And this is in the other direction, where the outrigger come at a very severe angle, in which resolving some of these forces is really also very complicated. One of the interesting things that we did in terms of the mega column, as I mentioned, these are very huge. In order to speed up the construction, we came up with a modular construction. As you can see, we pre-assembled the entire mega column, which include erection steel column connections, edge plates, rebar, everything in a single shot. And essentially, we end up erecting these elements pre-assembled with everything, so the workers don't have to spend time dealing with these heavy elements. Plus, we needed to catch up on terms of the construction. This is the scale of things. This is a person, give you an order of magnitude of the size. This is a pre-assembly yard that we use to prefabricate, pre-assemble these very large elements. Again, the interesting thing about these columns, as you can TC1, TC8, the corner columns, they are roughly at the biggest size, is 3.2, 3.65 meter. And TC2, this is the in the weak axis, and TC3 we have up to about 3.2 and 4.4 meter. These are pretty huge. But through this pre-assembly of the steel and rebar, we were able to, as you can see, we were able to use templates and also jigs to be able to make sure all the rebar fit together. As you can see, we work in the 3 different levels to speed up the construction and assembly of these elements. The other challenging aspects of this is the hammerhead. This is what we call this is here, which is about 7.4 meter by 4.3 meter. It's a massive concrete element. So you think about the heat of hydration, the temperature, how you manage that to prevent the cracking in these elements. Plus, it is a bit complicated as per the original design. The amount of horizontal ties that we needed to do. Again, we did a lot of studies in terms of providing an alternative system. This one is definitely a huge element where we have the center core here, but we were able to propose an alternative system in which we divide this element into like 2 columns, and they are confined. Unfortunately, structural engineers were not comfortable using such a system, even though we have proven that it is something we can do. And this is something in terms of you don't learn those from the code does not address how to deal with these massive elements in detail. So I think going to the basic principle of structural engineering and concrete, you can come up with really a pretty interesting idea. So we did run a very detailed abacus analysis to show the viability of simplifying the detailing for these major elements. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Just the key point I wanted to make is the core for the original is so huge. With this one, we were able to divide it into smaller units, in which using bow grid, which is a pre-assembled kind of rebar in which we have all the horizontal element kind of not welded but fused together with more strength than a typical tie that we have. In terms of behavioral issue, as you can see, this is the core of the column. And by dividing it the way we had, we divided it into two columns, which makes the system a little bit more manageable. So at this moment, because of time, I would just give you an idea in terms of what can be done and simplification using a new technology. And this is a pretty much, I would say, could represent a research project that by itself that somebody can take on. In terms of performance, what we have is the two models, the original and the new. There is no significant difference in terms of behavior. We take it up to the ultimate behavior, and there's no, but in terms of constructability, it does make a huge difference. The other challenge to this project that we have is the planning for the concrete work. Again, when we propose C105, many the client and the consultant were worried about, because when you have a high performance concrete with a high stiffness, and it's the first time it's being used in Malaysia, and pushing the limit from 85 that has not been exceeded since Vitruvian days to C105 was something we had to work very closely with the client. So we did a lot of extensive concrete testing program for high performance concrete, trial mixes, mechanical properties such as modulus of elasticity, and then they use a cube. And with the cube, really, it's not very reliable system. So through working with the client and the consultant Arab, and we're able to convert it from a cube to a cylinder testing instead. Durability test to make sure that initial, is also included in the testing. Initial surface absorption, 30-minute absorption, rubber chloride, permeability, creep and shrinkage testing. Why we need that? Because we need to understand when we design and we construct. Unfortunately, Arab and the consultant threw all this responsibility at the contractor, in which we had to do our own construction methodology and testing program and come up with a compensation program to ensure the verticality of the system. So we did a lot of testing to understand the creep and shrinkage characteristics of the concrete before we start the construction, in order to be running the analysis which I'll be speaking about. Also, pumping the concrete to about 550 meters in a single shot. So we did a lot of pump simulation tests. And because we have these massive elements, the heat of hydration, it was also very critical. So we needed to use low cement kind of concrete, which is from environmental standpoint, was very good. And so we did a lot of all the testing that we have to do, as most of you know, mechanical properties, mass concrete, 3-day cycle, high pumpability. This criteria that we have to put together in order to produce a concrete that we can use to build a building from. So it has to satisfy strength, low heat of hydration, 3-day cycle, high flow, high durability, and also put together a very extensive testing program on the site to make sure that we pump the concrete to that level. Curing procedures, also we had to do testing in terms of how to cure the concrete. And also in Malaysia, it's hot weather concreting, because we have to manage and control the temperature of the concrete at deposit and the maximum temperature that we can reach for these massive elements. So we did the very a detailed, extensive quality control program for this particular one, and we added a patch plant on site. So without this is kind of a show. We have done testing for all the requirement to ensure the client that we achieve the concrete strength and stiffness that we needed. In fact, we exceeded it. And in order to assure the client that to give him a comfort, we told him, okay, we have C105, but we will use C95 for strength design, because that didn't really make any difference, because what we needed it is for stiffness. And initial design that Arab has was about 40.5 gigapascal. We gave them about 45 gigapascal, and we achieved almost 75 gigapascal. Workability of the slump for the concrete, we also have high slump, which is up to, not slump, but really high flow concrete from 525 to 675. And the peak temperature we needed to achieve is for the concrete less than 78. As you can see here from this mixed design, we try not to rely heavily on the cement. We use GGPS and silica fume, and we use basalt in order to give us the stiffness that we need for strength. And we did all the testing program for all the concrete grades. The other thing is, again, we had to monitor what we promised the client. It became more like a research program in which we were able to achieve the strength up to about 120 MPa for cylinder. And for modulus, initially the client, we promised 45, but we were able to achieve close to 50 gigapascal, which is a significant benefit to the project from a stiffness standpoint. This is just large mock-ups that we have to do to show how we cure these massive elements to prevent cracking in the concrete. This is just workability with the high slump concrete at different time, and we were both looked at the slump and rheology of the concrete to make sure that we can pump it. So fortunately for high strength, high stiffness, we put a patch plant on site in which the transportation was not a major issue, and we have icing machine to shave the ice to put it part of the mix to control the temperature at deposit to within 25 degrees. Durability testing. This is concrete quality control program. This is here pump simulation that we had done for the project to go up to about 600 meter to simulate the amount of friction and the losses, and to make sure that the pumps that we select are not problematic for us. This is just an overview of the pump that we have at the beginning and the pump at the end, and we tested the concrete before we pump it and after we pump it. We have done an extensive creep and shrinkage testing program for all concrete grades, just to make sure this is really required to ensure that that what we are predicting in terms of building movement is accurate enough. And with this one, I think we have established a concrete testing program at Samsung Laboratory in Korea, in which we had a real-time monitoring of the entire testing program, including temperature, including the strain gauge, including for all kind of things to achieve what is the ultimate shrinkage and the creep parameters for this. And in summary, the question is what we did with this, all of this. The client required us that with this value engineering that we proposed and that we need to achieve the same performance that we have on the building. So we did. And when we look at what kind of parameter we should use, essentially for especially modulus of elasticity, when you look at the code, they are all over the place. But anyway, we were able to use Eurocode was with the testing program that we have to accurately predict these things. This shows the actual building behavior. Even though we reduced the concrete and the core by 15%, which is from environmental standpoint is a huge amount of concrete. And then also rebar by 14,000 ton, and then steel about 10,000 ton. We were able to, with the using high stiffness concrete, provide a building with exactly the same stiffness as the original design. So what they say, confirming design alternative relative to the building drift for both direction in the X and the Y direction. So there was no significant difference between the building performance with the reduction in material when using high performance concrete. The other thing we need to look at during construction is we need to levelness and the column shortening. We also looked at the soil structure interaction, looking at the actual pile stiffness and the soil spring stiffness that we have, and we had to do that as part of the construction sequence program that we had done. Again, you can see that using lateral displacement analysis, more or less, the original design is 456 and the alternative 459. So we exactly matched the lateral displacement, and then the inner story drift. Same thing, especially in the Y direction on the north east-west direction. We eliminated one outrigger, but we didn't really, the building was stiff enough, the core was big enough on its own right, and we didn't need to make much changes. So there was no significant difference in the behavioral response between these elements. In fact, the load on the pile has been reduced because we reduced the weight of the concrete by about 15% in the core. The other thing we need to look at is a construction sequence analysis, as I mentioned, which is one of the challenging things, relative displacement between the core movement, the core wall, the structural steel elements, and all these testing programs that we had done related to the concrete, we have to include it part of the analysis. And there is really, if you look at the E-value that we used, essentially is much higher than what is allowed by code. And out of the testing program, we achieved these coefficients in which we needed to implement them. This is one thing that is really creep and shrinkage verification. If you look at the model codes, whether AASHTO or CIP or Eurocode or PCA or CEP or GL 2000, and everybody have their own methodology. The question is, when you have these massive elements that are sensitive to building displacement, which code do you use? So fortunately, by using the actual testing program that we incorporated on the project and on site, we were able to get the actual results of the creep and shrinkage results, and we were able to see that the CEP or the European code and the Korean code were the closest to match what we had done. The other thing is the stiffness of the soil that we have is much bigger than originally anticipated, which means it's also affecting the differential movement of these elements. So we also have to modify that. And then since we got everything above and what is needed, we ran the analysis again regularly to look at the actual building behavior to make sure that during construction we are not hit by any kind of surprises. So what you will see here again, the displacement of the building has been reduced from the original design because we get more stiffness from 45 to 50, 10%, but also we have a stiffer foundation, so we're able to reduce the overall deformation of the building and more or less get a better performance building using high stiffness than originally designed. So we kind of had been able to manage that very well and give the client a building with less material, better performance, without changing significantly the structural system. The other thing that we need to deal with is this column, the intermediate column between the mega column that in which we have a differential movement we have to deal with. So we ran a monitoring program very closely, and as you can see here, the maximum initial displacement expected by the engineer were about 118 millimeter, but actually we got only roughly about 45 millimeter. And then looking at the actual behavior of the building, the lateral displacement, because of the asymmetry, we expect the building to drift about 220 millimeter. Because of the calibration that we had done, we're able to achieve very close to what we expected. So which testify that everything we tried was correct. And we also, through this process, we were able to reduce the differential shortening between the core and the column by equalizing the stress, eliminating the shrinkage more or less the same. And then the basic creep was the only thing that we have to deal with for these elements. So we were able to manage the differential pretty well. In terms of the differential between the steel column and the mega column, we also, the blue line that you'll see here is the location of the mega column, and the dots in between is the location of the steel. So we had to monitor that movement very closely to make sure that in the long term, we don't have a big differential between these elements that could have an impact on the facade and performance of the building. So we did that at several levels, and we identified in some areas would be problematic, in which the movement was higher than what we wanted to see. So we developed a compensation program and correction for the structural steel elements in which we build them. You think concrete is going to displace more, but in this case, we have the steel displacing more. So we had to make a correction for the structural steel, in which we adjusted the steel member sizes by roughly about 2 millimeter, and we were able to manage the differential between the structural steel members and the mega column to within 5 millimeter. And that's all also monitored at every floor to make sure that we can achieve that. The other interesting things about this building, we incorporated a very detailed, extensive health monitoring program that monitor the health of the building, starting with accelerometers at the base of the building to capture any earthquakes that's coming into the site during construction or for permanent building conditions. We have rest settlement elements. We have anemometer, accelerometers, strain gauges in all the column to measure the stress and strain and the movement. And also at the outrigger levels, we have dynamic strain gauges to not only measure the stress in the outrigger, they are structural steel during construction, but also what are the wind forces that they will get during the real time of the building. And so this building, what I would call is a digital twin, in which we're trying to investigate the actual behavior, what we designed versus what we actually measured in the building. And also we have tilt meter because the building drifted a lot to have a real-time assessment of the building behavior to ensure the verticality of the building during construction. In terms of the facade system, is we have different.
I'm sorry. Could you? Is there something that we could do to wrap up? I'm sorry. We're a bit over on time.
Okay, I will finish up. This is mechanical system. I don't have much time. Probably I will share this information with you at a later time in terms of the elevators. With this one, I just wanted to show this is the project over all view of integration of the project and the promenade with the rest of the Merdeka Stadium. Just an overview. From a construction methodology, it's a very complex site. Definitely, we need to look at the site logistic and the planning. This is just some of the overall site conditions. And also for the raft foundation, we had to cover the entire area with a temporary fabric or cover in order to, because we needed to cast it out for 48 hours. So we wanted to make sure that we are not affected by the rain or unexpected conditions. This is what we pumped the concrete down into the raft, and we poured it in a single shot. This design of this element is by itself is very interesting. This is what it looks like inside the raft during construction, in which everything was done undercover. And I had a small video, but I will skip that here. And this is overall construction planning for this project, which is a semi top-down construction. And with the tower is from bottom up. It's just some view of the semi top-down construction that we incorporated without the cross-lot bracing that's usually used in China in particular. And this is just showing construction photos of progress photos of the site. This is the outrigger. As you can see here, the structural steel mega column or composite column as part of the steel work rather than the concrete work, and the concrete work get filled up at a later stage. And today, more or less, this is before lifting the spire. Lifting of the spire in itself is very challenging, in which we have to create a lifting device in which we have telescoped the entire spire from below. And this is just a quick view of some of the lifting of the spire using hydraulic jacks, similar to what we did in Burj Khalifa. And as you lift up the spire, we added the cladding and all the architectural components lifted in one shot. And this is just to speed up the process. The spire is very thin, and we were able to attach the facade to it before we lifted up from a single lift locations. And so this is the final lifting of the spire. Again, each one of these topics can be a topic on its right in terms of the challenging aspects of having to work on these very massive elements. And with that, I think this is just some views of where the project is right now. And we almost now a word in terms of the using of concrete. Definitely a mile high concrete is becoming more a molding material, in which is no longer the concrete that we learned in the past. It's becoming more of a composite material, and it's beautiful material to use if it's used wisely. And with this one, I think also we need to keep in mind that modular construction is something with the new building systems that we need to keep in mind for future use of concrete. Again, we use composite walls, all of these things to avoid many of the temporary work that we typically do nowadays. So anything we can avoid and moving into more modular type of construction to maximize the off-site work than on-site work. And with that, I end up my presentation. I had a couple of videos, but short ones, but because of time, we're not able to show it. Thank you very much. Sorry for the being late.
All right, well, thank you, Ahmed. That's a great presentation, a great building, a lot of good information about construction technology with respect to concrete. Okay, why don't we get back started here? So we're very excited to have our next presenter with us, talk about wind engineering with tall buildings. So that's John Kilpatrick. So John Kilpatrick is the wind engineering practice leader at RWDI and a principal of the firm. John is a contributing author to the ASCE SEI pre-standard for performance-based wind design the ASCE 4921 standard for wind tunnel testing for buildings and other structures, the ASCE SEI Manual of Practice 143 Design and Performance of Tall Buildings for Wind, and is a former chair of the UK Wind Engineering Society. John, thanks for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Just share my slide deck here. And thanks for letting me be a part of this symposium. I'm going to be talking about wind strategies for tall buildings and using the wind tunnel as a design tool. A little bit about me. I've been working away at wind engineering, I suppose, for the last 25 plus years. I started out my career at the University of Western Ontario's Boundary Layer Wind Tunnel, where I did my master's and PhD work. And on completion, I joined RWDI, and I've been here ever since, although I have moved continents occasion. A little bit about RWDI. You know, we're lucky in a way. We're fortunate. We've worked on many tall and super tall building projects. Of the 10 tallest completed buildings in the world, we've worked on 8. And my graphic isn't up to date, as we saw from Ahmad, that there's a new number 2, and RWDI worked on that as well. So we're very lucky. What I'd like to do today is share a little bit of our experience with you all, and how wind tunnels can be used to shape tall buildings. A little overview. I'll talk about the wind loading chain, what that concept is. I'll talk a little bit about wind tunnel methods, because I'm not sure if everyone is aware of how wind tunnels work, and then I'll go into our case studies. So the wind loading chain, what is it? Well, it's a concept, really. It was developed by a fellow named Alan Davenport, who was the director of the Boundary Layer Wind Tunnel Laboratories, considered the father of wind engineering. And he thought, in order to look at wind loads and their effects on structures, we really need to think about everything that rolls up into that, including the climate, the influence of terrain and topography, building aerodynamics, structural dynamics, and lastly, we need to understand how to evaluate the performance of buildings through criteria. The analogy to the chain is actually a really good one, because you know the accuracy and our confidence in our abilities to predict wind loading on buildings is really only as good as the weakest link of that chain. So where do we see the wind loading chain, that concept? Well, we do see it in codes of practice. You know, we have this basic design wind speed maps that are part of the wind climate link. We have exposure factors and topography factors that account for the influence of terrain. We have pressure coefficient and force coefficient data that tells us a little bit about building aerodynamics. We have gust factors that deal with the dynamic effects. And we have basic criteria outlined in the standards. You know, in the wind tunnel, we tend to do things in a little bit more detail, using the same concept. So the wind climate, we tend to do more detailed studies and perhaps come up with site-specific wind speed recommendations. When it comes to the influence of terrain, we do detailed modeling of the surroundings, the terrain and the topography. For the building aerodynamics, we do bespoke wind tunnel tests, either for the building envelope or for the structure. When it comes to the building dynamics, we're working with structural engineers models, finite element models. We're providing feedback on the variation of the wind loads with wind direction and how they're impacted by building dynamics. And lastly, we do use criteria. I will talk a little bit more about criteria later on. One thing I wanted to plug today is a There's a manual of practice that's been released by the ASCE called Design and Performance of Tall Buildings for Wind. It's a good book. I was involved in it. That's not why I'm pushing it. The real reason is it's an industry consensus manual, and was put together by representatives from all of the leading structural engineering firms in North America to provide state-of-the-art guidance on tall building design and what you need to know about designing tall buildings. And the text in italics at the bottom is from a book review by that was that was published in the Structural Engineer. And I really like sharing this because essentially the reviewer said, hey, if you've got any questions about if you've got any thoughts about what you need to ask and how to ensure you get the right answers, this book will help achieve that. So I would highly recommend that to any engineers in the audience, but also any architects as well. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the wind tunnel method. And why do we need to wind tunnel test? Well, I'll come to the graphics in a moment. A little bit about conditions for code applicability. The code says, they're really applicable for when you have buildings that have regular shapes, no unusual geometry, no irregular spatial form. You have buildings that maybe are not susceptible to a crosswind loading or buffeting or vortex shutting. The images on the left-hand side of the page, those are examples of models upon which the code guidance is based. They're very simple, regular geometries. We've got a low rise on the bottom, mid rise on the top. Again, very simple. The surroundings are not complex. You see a couple of images on the right that show real projects, one in New York City, 432 Park Avenue, and another in Dubai, which is part of the expo. And you see reality is a lot more complicated. So when you have buildings that are complicated, it's a good idea to go into the wind tunnel. There's also some other triggers for testing when you have long periods of vibration, when your building height exceeds about 400 feet or 120 meters, when you have height to width aspect ratios greater than 4. Those are all reasons you also might undertake a wind tunnel test. One of the things I mentioned in this slide is a crosswind loading. And for those of you that don't know what I mean, crosswind loads occur when wind blowing onto a bluff body like the one in the image here causes wakes to shed from the body. It creates motions perpendicular to the wind. For a lot of tall, slender buildings, this is actually a major problem. When you're doing wind tunnel tests, there are some basic technical requirements that need to be satisfied to ensure that the model scale simulations of the wind responses will be good predictors of the full scale behavior. I'm going to go through some of the technical requirements. There are limitations, and I'll touch on one or two of those later. But in simple terms, the first thing you got to do is model the expected wind velocity profiles. The wind on the surface of the Earth is called boundary layer winds. They vary with height. And in order to have an effective simulation in the tunnel, you need to model those approaching wind velocity fields, what we call far field effects. You need to model the turbulence or gustiness of the wind. So the turbulence varies whether you're in open country or at the seaside or in a major urban center. The turbulence or gustiness varies, and we need to model that reasonably accurately. There's a little bit of leeway here when we do model the turbulence, but not a lot if we want to do a good job. It goes without saying that you need to have an accurate model of the development. So in the wind tunnel, when we do a test, we're building scale models, typically 1 to 300 or 1 to 400 scale. We build the study buildings, we build the surroundings, and in the wind tunnel, when we do our simulations of the far field, the velocity flows approaching the site, the interaction with the surroundings creates and simulates what we call the near field effects. One biggie that a big difference between the wind tunnel and reality. The wind tunnel, if you like, is a duct. It's a box that we push air through. Okay, and that's very unlike full scale, where flows are not bounded other than at the ground. So we need to be careful when we're doing wind tunnel testing that we don't exceed, a blockage in the duct of about 8% typically. Um, there are different types of wind tunnels that are more blockage tolerant than others, and so you can maybe push that limit a little bit. But in general, we need to be mindful of blockage. A question everybody might have is, how well do wind tunnels perform? It's a tough question to answer because, in truth, there is not a lot of full-scale data that has been gathered and direct comparisons of predictions done with that full-scale data. One major exception was a study in Chicago that took place from 2000 to 2005. MOD was part of that. SOM supported that, and we looked at a number of buildings in SOM's portfolio. And we repeated the wind tunnel studies. We took full-scale measurements of the building motions and behavior. We compared analytical models of the structure and the structural properties with the full-scale measured properties. So there was a significant validation program undertaken. And I'm happy to say this won an award in 2008 from the ASCE for being a state-of-the-art study in civil engineering. So I'm going to jump into the case studies now. I've picked a number of buildings that were part of the graphic I showed earlier and some that were not. I'm going to start with type A 101. This was a study we did quite some time ago now, 1998. It's a tower that's over 500 meters tall. It was the tallest in the world at the time. It's located in a seismic region where there's typhoons regularly. And the design team worked with us to optimize the performance of the building because the initial tests indicated we had some work to do. I'll come to that in a minute. A TMD was also employed in this building to provide, the level of occupant comfort that we were after. Why did we need to optimize? Well, for the strength design of the building, or the ultimate wind loads were actually higher than anticipated. The early alternates of this tower had sharp corners, and we found that the crosswind loads on this tower were quite high. So we investigated a number of options with the architect and structural engineers, see which of these corner options you see on the left-hand side might give us the best behavior. And what we found, having reentrant corners of a sawtooth form, was a reduction in the crosswind loads of about 40% and a reduction in drag loads of about 25%. Now that reduction results in reduced quantities of concrete and steel. So that's a positive. It wasn't enough, however. The accelerations of the building, which is a measure of the comfort, were actually a little bit too high. So we needed to do something to control that. And on this particular project, we used a tune mass damper to bring building accelerations down to reasonable levels. And this is just, that was footage of it vibrating during a typhoon in 2015. So it's that's about 600 tons, if I recall correctly, of mass moving quite some distance. They are effective. Burj Khalifa is the next tower I want to talk about. Peter and Ahmed have both worked on this. RWDI was involved. Again, one thing to think about here, or one way I'll set this up, building a tower of this height had never been done. And, when we look at towers that are 300 or 400 or even 500 meters. There's precedent for that. A tower of this height had never been built. So, and one of the things we didn't know is how do the winds at that height above ground vary? We use boundary layer models in the codes that are pretty reasonable for the 2 or 3 or 400 meters above the surface of the earth. But what about at this height? We also worked with the clients, the architect and engineer here to look at the orientation of the tower, look at some of the features of the building. And this optimization really was a success. When we think in terms of comfort, our initial tests suggested very high acceleration levels, well beyond what would be considered acceptable. And through this optimization process, we were able to reduce that to tolerable levels without a damper. So these detailed climate studies, what do they involve? Well, just as a bit of background, wind data that's available to most researchers are surface level measurements taken at 10 meters above ground. We're talking about a building that's pushing beyond 800 meters in height. So we need to understand how to relate that extreme wind speed at 10 meters to the winds at elevation or at height. So we decided to do some regional climate modeling, and these essentially use reanalysis data sets from surface data, balloon data, data from ships with a climate model. What we did was actually simulate known extreme events. And the panel on the upper left here shows a type of wind event that's actually not a boundary layer wind, but a high level jet, I would call it. So the maximum winds were at a height of about 700 meters, and they actually reduced above that. So that's an interesting type of event. The panel on the upper right shows wind speed variation with height, and it's a little bit more close to what we might expect from a traditional boundary layer model, but it was different. But we were able to look at extreme events in Dubai to come up with guidelines on how to take those surface wind speeds and scale them to the top of the tower so that we're not being overly conservative. One of the really interesting outcomes of this work was an optimization process. So we found through the initial wind tunnel testing that the aerodynamic loads were the lowest when winds were blowing into one of the noses or one of the wings. The green arrow, if you want to think of it that way. The red arrow indicates the highest loaded wind directions. And there was a conscious decision to rotate the building and plan to align the highest loaded wind directions with the wind directions that were least likely to have strong winds. And that was a huge part of this study. Really great quote here from Bill Baker of SOM. We virtually designed the tower and the wind tunnel. In the old days, wind tunnels were for confirming forces, not to tell you what the building would look like. So this was an example where not only was the orientation of the building looked at, the size and location of the setbacks of the terraces were looked at and optimized to really bring the wind responses of the tower down. So a real success. Shanghai Tower. This is another interesting tower. It's 632 meters. It's now the world's third tallest building. Another one located in a high seismic zone with regular typhoons. And from the outset, there was a realization that something needs to be done to optimize this building. What was interesting was the design team agreed, hey, let's start out on the upper left corner of the page here. Let's start out with a tapered box, which has a similar massing to the that we want. And then what happens when we rotate the footprint of the building with height through 100 degrees, through 110 degrees, 120 or 180? And what happens if we orient the footprint of the building relative to the strong winds? So through a program of optimizing the form, resultant base moments of the building were reduced by almost 30%, which is significant. How significant? Well, these are some words I've pulled off of Gensler's website, discussing the Shanghai Tower and how effective these optimization strategies were. The end result was, through optimizing the building, $58 million worth of materials was saved. So that's, to me, super impressive. One thing that's common between this tower and Taipei 101, the optimization, it wasn't enough to aerodynamically to optimize the structure for serviceability. The building accelerations were still a little bit excessive. And so a 2-mass damper was required for this tower as well. The largest application of eddy current damping ever used on a damper, 1,000-ton damper. And I can tell you the aesthetics were as important to the client as the mechanical design of this feature of the building. So that was a real feat of engineering in itself. Jeddah Tower was not quite complete yet, but it has many of the things that we've already seen through the presentation that could be considered strategies for optimizing tall building response. We've got a significant taper with height. We've got a plan form that's broadly similar to Burj Khalifa. We went through a program with the client here, looking at, again, detailed studies of the climate, lots of tests using the force balance, pressure integration, and aeroelastic model techniques to validate the measurements and confirm. And we also introduced a technique here, which is now quite common, but at the time it was novel, called dynamic optimization. A little bit about the climate model. Jeddah, the location of this tower, there's some topography nearby, which meant we wanted to understand how that topography might affect winds at height. And keep in mind, this tower is over 1,000 meters tall. So we needed to do that climate modeling again. The graphic on the bottom right is a plot of actual observed data, which is the blue curve, against the simulation data from the regional climate model. And you can see very good agreement. So what these models allow us to do is simulate the weather, look at extreme wind events, and use that information and the information about wind speed variation with height to advise the team. Regarding dynamic optimization, if you like, think of these as heat maps. You know, each one of these is something different. We've got 50-year base moments on the left. On the far right, we've got 10-year peak accelerations. And in the curves, we generally show generalized stiffness along the bottom axis, generalized mass on the vertical axis. So this map kind of tells you what it tells the client what they should do and where they should spend their effort. So this map in particular shows us that this is the 10-year peak accelerations. Changing the stiffness of the building really wouldn't result in any improvement in the overall peak accelerations. However, changing the mass of the building by increasing it would lead to a reduction. The curve on the bottom here shows what would happen if you could increase the damping. So that's one of the innovations introduced in this project, which is now which is done on virtually every project we do, whether it's 100 meters tall or 1,000. 432 Park Avenue. This is in New York. It's a different looking building. So it's not tapered. There are no setbacks. It's an extruded prismatic form, and that's something the architect wanted, felt quite strongly about. So we had to approach this a little bit differently. And so we use the concepts of opening up the mechanical or the technical floors to the flow. So allowing flow to effectively blow through the structure. And what that tends to do is reduce the coherence of those vortices that create those crosswind motions. Now that was effective. It reduced accelerations by 50%, which is great. You can see one of those open technical floors here on the image on the right. There's at least 5 levels on that building. We still needed damping of at least 6% to hit the performance target. So this is an example of performance-based design I'd like to share with everybody. We use a motion simulator for this project and several of the other ones we saw earlier. What we do with these is actually feed time histories of the motion of the building that we get from the wind tunnel tests and bring the design team into these motion simulators to experience the motion themselves. It's the next best thing to being in an actual structure. And we can cast images of the cityscape on the walls around this simulator. And what we can do with the design team is decide on the target performance criteria. And once we have that, we could then work out, well, how big a damper do we need to get there? On this particular building, there's 2 proposed pendulum dampers, the total 660 tons. It's the largest passive dampers worldwide. I'm nearing the end of the presentation. I'm just going to revisit the wind loading chain quickly. One of the limitations of our wind tunnel tests is that we can't simulate Reynolds numbers at the small test scales that we usually test at, 1 to 300 to 1 to 4 or 500 scale. So we have to, that isn't a problem for structures that have sharp edges where flow tends to separate from those edges. It can be a problem for curved structures. So examples I've shown here are the Burj Khalifa and the Shanghai Tower. We took to a wind tunnel in Ottawa at the National Research Council and built very large scale aerodynamic models where we measured surface pressures and integrated those to look at the forces, and compared those with what we're measuring at our smaller scales to make sure that what we're getting at the smaller scales is truly representative of what we should expect at full scale. These models are huge. I've got a colleague there that's virtually 6 feet tall. It just gives you an idea of the scale of this wind tunnel and the models. We often do aeroelastic tests for super tall buildings. Now, super tall buildings can be unusually flexible with long periods of vibration, and they do move. They vibrate, and sometimes these large amplitude motions can adversely affect the wind forces on the building, amplifying the loading. So on many super tall projects, we might finish off with an aeroelastic model test to provide a really accurate confirmation of the wind response and give everybody comfort that it's going to work. Supplementary damping, you saw in a few of the projects that, well, more than a few, 3 of the 5 have dampers in them. There was a time where dampers weren't very, it was considered a problem to use a damper in a building, and the way to optimize the structure may be through mass and stiffness, but increasingly damping is considered now. And these are some illustrations of various types of dampers in tall buildings around the world. Performance-based design, I just want to touch on that. I talked a little bit about it in the context of looking at criteria and setting the criteria for buildings. Most tall building design is linear elastic. There is now a framework in the pre-standard for performance-based wind design that allows certain elements of the building to become inelastic. And the goal is to allow this approach. It could lead to better, more efficient structures that are more cost effective. The trick, I guess, is in order to do this properly, it's quite computationally intensive, and you need wind tunnel generated time series to do that. So that's an area where we're working a lot in today. Just to summarize effective wind strategies, I think any super tall buildings or mega tall structures need to understand the wind climate and what's going on at height, because winds do generally increase with height, and so the wind effects at height can be significant. You need to understand the impact of building aerodynamics on the loads, and the number of effective strategies that have been demonstrated are changes in plan form, changes, tapering the building, twisting or rotating it, or even including strategic openings in the building envelope. Looking at building dynamics and optimizing the dynamics is important. Carefully look at mass and stiffness. Can performance-based methods be used to refine the structural design? And can we use damping on these structures to achieve the goals and the targets we want to achieve? Final slide is really just to say anything is possible. Tall buildings have been designed in the wind tunnel for many years, and virtually every tall building is now designed in the wind tunnel, whether it's 100 meters or 1,000. The reason is the benefits can be significant. Over the last 20 years, the height of the tallest buildings in the world has doubled, and they're set to continue, in my opinion. We know there's a number of tools at our disposal that can help optimize the structures for wind. And the sky is really the limit. And 1,000-meter tower is currently under construction, and we know mile-high concepts are out there being developed. It's only a matter of time before we see these built. Anyway, with that, I'd like to thank you.
Thank you, John, for excellent presentation. One question I have, maybe to lead off here, you went through a number of case studies, which are great, and illustrated the different strategies that have been used. In your opinion, what are the most effective shaping strategies that can be used for super tall and mega tall?
Well, I would say tapering the building and reducing the sail area at elevations. That's critical. But you also have to think about the actual shape of the building. So a tapered building that's square still has higher inherent loads than a more circular form building. So I think more streamlined shapes that taper with height are generally more successful. I think there's a lot of aerodynamic treatments that can be used to improve the responsibility of buildings. The spire on the top of 118 that Ahmad showed earlier, I'm not sure if everyone picked up, but the surface of that spire was porous, and that's intentional. It was done that way to reduce the across-wind loading acting on that spire. So you have to think consciously about how to minimize the wind effects on the structure, but tapering and using the building aerodynamics to good effect is important. I know Bill Baker, we worked with Bill at SOM for many years, and Bill very recently, his opinion was there's a lot you can do with shaping the building to optimize performance. You may not need to use a damper if you think carefully about what you're doing first. The damper, of course, is, if you like, it's icing on the cake. If you need it, many different types of devices that can be used, and
Great. Well, thanks, John. Thanks again for your presentation.
Thanks.
With that, we'll move to our next presenter. So Javier Sesma, who's the VP of Business Development with TK Elevator. Let me get his bio up on the screen. So Javier is Vice President of Business Development globally at TK Elevator, that's formerly ThyssenKrupp, where he is responsible to support the growth and business expansion of TK business with global key accounts, major projects, and strategic partnerships. Javier has over 26 years of experience on business development, innovation, and internationalization. Starting his professional career at Anderson Consulting with international assignments in Puerto Rico and the USA. He spent his majority of his professional experience at TK Elevator, where he has over 24 years on elevator, escalators, airport systems, and digitalization, with responsibilities in sales, operations, services, corporate and international assignments in North America, the United Kingdom, Spain, and Latin America, among others. In the last 9 years, he has led the global team at TK Elevator Innovation Center at Gijón, Spain, which has contributed significantly to the success and global product launch of some of TK's innovative technologies like iWalk, Excel, automatic docking assistance for airport passenger boarding bridges, MaxLot cloud platform, or HoloLink, among others. Generating more than 80 patents worldwide and contributing significantly to position TK Elevator within the innovation leaders in urban mobility and digitalization. Javier is passionate for construction, engineering, entrepreneurship, and people development, and is co-inventor of 10 patents on vertical and horizontal transportation technologies, is a frequent speaker on international conferences and press spokesperson for innovation at TK Elevator. He holds a Master of Science in Industrial Engineering, a Master of Advanced Studies, and postdoctoral studies at the European School of Management and Technology of Berlin. Javier, welcome. And thank you for presenting here today. Let me turn the screen over to you.
Hello, can you hear me well? Okay. So first of all, thank you very much, University of Illinois, Professor Mansour, also Jim, and also thanks very much for all the attendees here today, and also virtually for giving us the opportunity to show here today our vision about the future of vertical transportation. Let me just start to probably give you a first intro about what TK Elevator is. Probably most of us most of you know us as ThyssenKrupp before. We have been a company that has been a spin-off, now owned by Advent and Cinven, with customers in more than 100 countries, more than 1,000 sales and service locations, a team of 50,000 employees with more than 100 nationalities, and also with a figure of more than 8 billion. Oops. So ESG, first of all, is an integral part of the strategy of TK Elevator. So we have been recognized as one of the global leaders in climate protection, endorsing the business ambition for 1.5 degrees. Also top rated among 500 industrial companies by Sustainalytics, and also 2 consequent years in a row listed in the category A list of Carbon Disclosure Project on climate, and also for supplier management. And we have been one of the first contributors in the industry of elevation to obtain an EPD. So which is our promise? Our promise is to work together with designers, architects, consultants, and developers to do more sustainable buildings and better performance in green building rating systems using tools like obviously life cycle assessment to support our customers to get BREEAM or LEED sustainable certifications. We don't have the most comprehensive product portfolio. Probably everybody knows us because let me see if this works better. Okay. Okay. Everybody knows us about elevators and escalators or moving walks, but also we are very active in the world of airport solutions, home solutions, accessibility, and service, because that is one of the most critical elements during the life cycle of the building. And we have been, probably as per our discussions before, we have been very leading most of the innovations in this industry with, for instance, accelerating moving walkways propelled by linear motors, what we call pedestrian highways, also twin cabin systems that I will present today, multi-cabin systems without any ropes, and also focus very much on everything that has to do with data-driven mobility, like Internet of Things, user experience, and focusing more and more on the concept of the smart building. And where do we test all these innovations? I think today we are speaking about tall buildings, and as John was mentioning, wind tunnels, how do we test the high-rise and vertical transportation? We test that in test towers. Probably the first one you see on your left is Atlanta Test Tower, home of TK Elevator headquarters here in the US, that has been inaugurated less than 4 weeks ago. The one you see in the center is Rottweil, where we don't have a multi-showcase already one-to-one working. That includes also a mass damper, in our case, not to eliminate the movement of the building, rather to create and foster building movement to be able to test the high rise. And then the last one is Songshan, which are probably one of the 3 best testing facilities we have worldwide. And we have been committing to tall performance of buildings since more than 65 years. Probably the first high rise for TK Elevator, that was the TV Tower in Moscow, 350 meters in 1955, with a team of 40 experts and more than 1,000 projects worldwide. Some of the examples of our trajectory in high-rise buildings here, particularly in the US, Time Warner Center, designed by SOM, with almost 80 elevators, escalators, and elevators for disabled, but also Philadelphia Comcast Tower, where also is a 300 meters tower with almost 50 elevators and escalators, one of the first green skyscrapers on the US East Coast, and one of our, let's say, icon reference buildings, which is One World Trade Center. I was visiting that again another time this Monday, where we have supplied more than 80 elevators and escalators, has the fastest elevators in the northern hemisphere, moving at 9 meters per second, and also has received more awards, a building of 550, almost 550 meters. And what I wanted to speak to you today was about the concept of multi-cabin systems. I think, I mean, we discussed this a lot, and I think part of this presentation fits very much as a continuation what Peter was initiating about the discussion about the core of the building. When we see how we are building tall buildings today, core might represent about 40% of the space in tall buildings. And one of the challenges, as Peter also was mentioning, was how we can reduce the core of the tall buildings. There is no doubt that industry has been going through a trend of trying to increase and maximize handling capacity. Double deckers being probably one of the most advanced solutions in the market as of today, where by adding 2 cabins in the same shaft, fully connected, we can have advantage like group arrangements. We can be very effective when we need to transport a lot of people using as express shuttles to serve sky lobbies, as was also presented in most of the high-rise buildings. can be a very effective system when we are speaking about up peaks, and also obviously makes sense if we don't have fewer stops. However, I mean, double decks have also some challenges. I mean, we need to transfer between floors. There are 2 entry levels. We always need to keep the same distance between floors because the 2 cabins are fixed. One of the biggest challenges probably that we see is that we have to move heavy car masses. We always need to move 2 cars. I mean, just think about it. I mean, we are moving about 25 tons of equipment, even to move 1 or 2 passengers. And it offers sometimes less flexibility in the shaft due to the connected cars, particularly when we are doing interfloor traffics. And sometimes from a user perspective, we have seen passenger discomfort because of what is called the phantom stops. I mean, we are maybe loading the upper car and the passengers in the lower car don't know what is happening, but the elevator is stopped. That's something that is a technology that also most of us has. We have supplied one of the fastest double decks in the world for Shanghai World Financial Center, a building of almost 500 meters, energy efficiency class A. So we know about this technology. What was our challenge? In 2003, we started to think about what if we were able to decouple the cabins? What if we were able to invent a system where we can move 2 cabins independently in 1 shaft? I mean, by using something like this, we might be able to reach the same traffic performance and reducing between 30 to 50% the elevator shaft footprint. We can save building space, we can reduce waiting time, because at the end of the day, we are going to select the cabin that will take us quicker to the destination, and we can optimize traffic handling. Let me show you in this technology in a small video.
Our lifestyles are changing. Our traffic conditions are changing. Everything is changing. When taking elevators, racing against time, you must be aware the traditional methods cannot satisfy today's demands. Teaming elevator leverages the ability to innovate when it develops the twin elevator system to meet this challenge. Twin has 2 independent same shaft, which saves 30 to 50% of the area of elevators, reduces the construction costs, and makes the area. If it is impossible to build extra shafts in modernization projects, when cancelled vertical traffic in elevators, TK Elevator makes barriers to design elevators will enhance flexibility. Training is applied to buildings with various form distances. Each floor has a connection machine and control system, which requires lower machinery height and more flexible machinery arrangement. Training is installed by sharing the shaft, handle, and set of guardrails. At the same time, various counterweight bands and flexible traffic to level shaft lengths. As the cars are not restricted by harmful buildings with various form distancing. During traffic peaks, trains with control system ensures that the 2 cars operate independently while increasing capacity by 30%. Assistive control system also controls force and action in the building, but also calculates passive flow and cars intelligently during low passenger flat areas. The intelligent control system will switch on one of the cars, which ensures the efficient use of energy by reducing power consumption by 30%. And behind such a brilliant product, there must be strong engineering ability. Train's 4-level safety system is the best proof through its destination selection control system with destination force logic. The control system monitors the distance between and then the pass function and reach the 5 daily salary. When the distance between the tasks is smaller than a defined safety value, the contribution and the two tasks emergency brake and the safety certification works in SCP and is essential to develop as Airbus and Boeing. Trend is used observation tower invention. Now, you can start at any time and experience the traffic system of tomorrow. TK elevator trend.
So what is one of the possibilities that moving independent cabins allows as architects, as designers? Allows, first of all, flexible configuration and impressive design. So with Twin, we can probably impact one of the first things we see when we enter into a building or when we leave the building, which is different sky levels with different distancing. This is the example of some bottles in London. With Twin, we can increase revenue because reducing the square foot by the elevator footprint, we can give a return to the investors. That is some of the use cases that I will present later on. Maximizes efficiency because in the car hall, we are already selecting our destination and the system is going to send us the cabin that will quicker take us to our destination. And also because of the safety level, gives a peace of mind when we are moving to independent cabins in one shaft. But Twin also has some other benefits. I mean, when we consider the impact of the embodied carbon of the building, this is a very simple example we have done for some bottles in London, one of our first Twin references, where by using 2 independent cabins in one shaft, we were able to reduce the number of shafts from 14 to 8 multi-cabin systems, reducing the space needed for elevators with almost 3,000 square meters, and also avoiding more than 40 tons of embodied carbon in the building if we just consider the saving on the guiding rails alone. If we consider also the impact of not doing this additional 6 elevator shaft, which is normally not part of our scope, the positive impact would have been even greater. So some examples how this could look like in real case buildings, when buildings in cases where we were having like 2 shafts with 2 groups of conventional elevators, we have been able to reduce this to 12 shafts with 2 groups of 5 twins plus 1 conventional elevator. So in essence, we were moving from 20 cabins to 22 cabins, but from 20 shafts to 12 shafts. So we can start to imagine the saving on the building core. Some examples of the exercise that we do with the architects and the consultants early in the design. We start to do typically vertical transportation scenarios where we compare based on the building use different scenarios with different technologies, conventional elevators, twin elevators, double deckers, different combinations of lower, mid, and high rise groups, and trying to target always the minimum waiting time and selecting the best solution for the customer. So by doing smart planning, we are able to achieve impressive designs like the one of Trinity Tower in Paris that has been one of the awards of excellence this year in CTBUH with 8 twin systems, 30 conventional lifts and 3 escalators. Or also we can save the return on the investment to our customers. This is a real example of a 300 meters building in Asia Pacific with 61 floors, with a population of 6,700 people, where by doing smart planning, we have been able to reduce an initial scenario of 31 elevators with 4 double decks to move a population of 6,700 people to a scenario of 16 twins, 5 double decks, and 2 elevators. So we have been achieving a reduction of 43% on the elevator core, but also improving the traffic with an average time to destination improvement of 17.5%. So we have been able to give better performance to the building and also increasing the population that could be moved with this vertical transportation from 6,700 to almost 7,000. And what is the benefit for the customer? If we try to extrapolate the return on the investment of this free space of elevator core that we give them back to the owner in doing an exercise of over 10 years using Knight Frank market price levels, we are able to achieve a return, an additional return in cities like Hong Kong of almost 100 million euros, Shanghai, Beijing, Singapore, or Sydney that around 50, 60,000 euros, or cities in Mumbai like 30,000 euros. This directly connects with the challenge that Peter was mentioning about how we can also provide an additional return to the owners. And one of the biggest challenges that we don't have in tall buildings as of today, which is vertical efficiency on the vertical transportation systems. One of the other challenges that we typically have when we want to increase capacity is the interfloor traffic. I mean, today we are building we are designing a building with a certain tenant arrangement, but what happens when we are trying to increase the capacity using double decks, that odd and even floors cannot be appear anymore. And sometimes when we are looking at the times of the day with the interfloor traffic, we can lose about 50% of the cars, which is not the case that when we are able to decouple the cabins and let them move independently into the building. What happens when we are looking at energy? I mean, if we look at the traffic pattern over one day, I mean, typically we will only need the full handling capacity 30% of the day. In the rest part of the day, we don't need the full capacity of vertical transportation. What this implies, this is an example of comparing two systems, a group of 6 high-rise twin with a group of 6 high-rise double decks. You can see already in the electrical load calculation, probably the conclusion is very obvious. When we don't need the full handling capacity, in double deck, we are always moving 2 cabins. We are always moving these 20, 25 tons that we discussed, whereas in twin, we only need to move the cabins that needs to transport passengers. That is directly reducing on the energy in addition to the footprint. So when we are thinking about high-rise strategy, what we could do? Maybe the first thing we could do with technologies like twin is merge low-rise and high-rise group. By doing that, we automatically are reducing the elevator's footprint. We can also do different arrangements like the ones that were showing before in terms of overlapping a little bit the low-rise and the high-rise group using twin and also express decks to the sky lobbies. And what would be probably the smartest thing to do? Well, why don't we take the best of both? I was saying at the beginning, double deck is very efficient when we want to have a high handling capacity, a high speed, a shuttle. So why not combining double decks for express shuttles to the sky lobbies with twins for the local or interfloor transportation? So these are real examples of a mixed-use building where we are having maybe on the top part a hotel, in the lower part on the office. Typically, as designers, we don't want to mix people who is going to work with people who is going to maybe go to leisure. So we can even create a separation using the upper part of the twin in the lower part of the twin, or we can even create building zones. So in this case, very similar as what Ahmad or Peter were showing in terms of separating different building zones with modules about 100 meters where we can have local twins and then express shuttles to move to the sky lobbies. I'm happy to also share with you today that our first twin installation in the US is already being installed in Hudson Yards. One of the major developments, well, definitely the major in North America, one of the majors worldwide, where we are installing 16 twin systems, 9 double decks, 55 single deck elevators, including all the buildings in Hudson Yards. We are doing more than 200 equipment. We are late in the US. We have more than 500 twin systems worldwide in the 5 continents. So we are looking forward for the opening of this building to start to obviously provide this technology in North American market. Another example of how we have applied this mix between twin and double decks is Riyadh in Saudi, P4 CMA Tower, where we have combined, let's say, the power of twin systems for the interfloor traffic with the express shuttles to the sky decks with double deck elevators, a building of almost 400 meters, which is under finalization, LEED Gold certified, and also awarded by different awards. And what about the future? I mean, the future for us is probably trying to solve the holy grail of the elevator industry, which is taking out the cables of the cabin. Since the year 2000, the number of super tall buildings has tripled. I mean, nobody discussed, despite pandemic, despite any other events, we still keep on constructing almost 3 times as what we were doing almost 20 years ago. But also this brings that tall buildings are becoming like vertical cities. If there is something that we have seen during COVID is that we need to create vertical cities which are sustainable places for living. And more we start to see designs where we don't have horizontal connections. Either if it's a residential condominium, like the one you see in Singapore, or either if it's an office tower, like the one you see in China, or any other. So buildings are becoming vertical cities, but tenants and users are looking for more sustainable places to live. And also it's clear that vertical cities can free up space at the street level to make more livable cities. How do we can make this sustainable? Just imagine we are able to eliminate the cable of the cabin, and we were able to propel multiple cabins. We are and make them circulate within the building. So we will be creating a system that enables architects to design buildings without any limitation in height, in shape, or also in type of mobility. That is, will give them multiple possibilities, and that's why we call this technology multi. Has been already awarded by Time, by Edison Awards, CTBUH, offers greater architectural freedom, shift of building high limits, reduce footprint versus capacity, because we are able to move not just 2 cabins, multiple cabins, less passenger queuing, because this will work very similarly as like the patterns in the past, and we are moving from just an electromechanical system to a fully digital system. Let me show you how this technology looks like.
The birth of the elevator. This invention changed the way we live. One cabin in one shaft on one road, traveling up and down. A principle that hasn't changed for 160 years. 2003, the twin elevator changed the industry. 2 cabins independently in one shaft. In the future, more and more people will live in megacities. Today, building development is constrained by the forms of mobility available. A revolution is required. We started to reinvent the elevator concept. What if we were to omit the road and have direct drives part of the elevator gap? What if we were to provide more than 2 cabins in one shaft and let them circulate in the building? What if we were to invent a ground-breaking system enabling the cabins to move at night. But also no limits in height, shape, there are multiple possibilities. And that's why we call it multi.
So which are the possibilities of this system? So let's imagine we don't have a building where we are in a peak. So we can have maybe 6 shafts where inside we are moving 24 cabins. Typically, we saw what probably is the most efficient transportation system is a semi-continuous system. So something as similar as the paternoster. But what happens when it's maybe 10, 1 o'clock by night and we don't need that transportation capacity? So what we can do is what we call the off-peak mode, where we are able, using the exchangers, take some of the cabins and park them in what we call a garage. So just less on one thing. So by combining vertical movement, horizontal movement, number of cabins, and number of exchangers, we are able to create a customized transportation system for our building. And we can adapt the transportation system to the building demand. So multi in short is multiple cabins in one shaft, smaller shafts, because the concept of multi is point-to-point destination, less number of shafts, no machine room needed on the top of the shaft, because what we are doing is propelling multiple cabins. When we presented this technology, the press called Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, because I don't know if you remember that movie, but that's essentially what multi is about. No limits in height, structure, or building shape. It's a digitally native system. And in order to propel cabins, we know exactly every time where a cabin is, when a cabin is coming, and we energize that part of the shaft. So it's a fully digitally native system. And we can either choose of reducing the building footprint or freeing up space to have additional income. Multi also can increase the capacity, reducing the elevator footprint. Obviously, that could be a benefit on embodied carbon of the building. Also, it's quite interesting that probably using a similar energy than a conventional system, the peak load is much lower because we are only energizing the cabin which is moving. We can regenerate energy when we are going down. We are using the linear motors to create energy and plug it into the grid, and we can adapt the transportation system to the demand. So what about how can we apply multi? Is multi something that can be applied everywhere? Well, typically what we see, one of the biggest benefits of multi is this concept of semi-continuous transportation system. So using multi as a shuttle. And we can have maybe buildings where we can have even different modules of low-rise groups that would be machine roomless, for instance, 2.5 meters per second, or we can even go for a different configuration where still having a multi as a shuttle system, we can have a twin low-rise, mid-rise, and high-rise to do the interfloor traffic. This is, I mean, some of this casuistic is what we see as of today. We don't have tenants where technology companies where the biggest demand is interfloor traffic, because the way these technologies companies are working in the workspaces. If we compare some of these concepts, all of these are scenario exercises we have done for real customers. Just comparing, for instance, a double deck shuttle versus a multi shuttle, we can save about 20% of the elevator shaft, and comparing the double deck for the local shaft versus the twin about 30%. So twin and double deck is already a winning solution for vertical transportation, but probably multi and twin combined together is even better. And what else? So really our vision is, I mean, we clearly see that in future, moving people and data will push the boundaries of the building envelope. I mean, we truly believe that tall buildings will not be just buildings on the surface, will be connected to the rest of the public infrastructure. And for that also, technologies like multi can play a very interesting role. So they can be connected directly to public infrastructure. We have discussions in cities like London where they wanted to build a new metro line, and how do you bring people from 70 meters underground to the surface? You don't have a vertical node to bring people to the surface, so you need to move on different directions. We clearly see that the future is going to be driven by data, because data can really advance and extend the life cycle of our equipment between 20 to 40%. We also need to consider that by 2030, about 75% of the working population is digitally native. They would like to interact with our vertical transportation systems differently. And that's why part of most of the technologies we are developing right now has to do with building operations, machine learning using Max Suite, and Agile for the best passenger experience, touchless calls, enabling the movement of robots within the buildings. Both technologies are already digitally native. For us, the test tower of Rottweil is not just a test tower, but it's also a digital building. So we are operating the test tower as a digital twin, creating what could be for us the heart of the smart building. And last slide is how do we see the future? Well, we see the future in a three-dimensional mobility. I mean, we see that in the future, yes, there will be vertical transportation systems, there will be tall buildings, but probably there will be connections in the third dimension, not just at surface level or underground, but maybe at the sky level, to make those places more livable, more sustainable. So the future, we believe, is going to be 3D, not just at different levels, but also because we will be moving people, we will be moving goods, and we will be moving data. So with that, any questions? I leave my contact there. Thanks very much for your attention, and also hoping open for questions now or later during the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Javier. I think in the interest of time, we're going to move to our last presentation, and we can further discuss any questions we may have for Javier in the panel discussion. Okay, so our final presenter is Luc Leon. Luc is a lead fellow, ASHRAE Epidemic Task Force Commercial Team Leader, ASHRAE Task Force for Building Decarbonation, Embodied Carbon LCA Work Group Leader, Carbon Leadership Forum MEP 2040 Founding Leader, City of Chicago Decarbonation Task Force, AIA COVID-19 Task Force, BOMA Toronto Health Committee Co-Chair, Chair of ASHRAE Environmental Health Committee, ASHRAE Distinguished Lecturer, former Chair of ASHRAE TC 9.12 on tall buildings, former Board of Directors for USGBC, Illinois, Industry Advisory Board for IN2 Startup Incubator Program with US National Renewable Energy Laboratory. In addition, he's been an active member of the Chicago Committee on High-Rise Buildings for a decade and a half. He is the firm-wide director for Sustainability Engineering Studio for Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. His work includes Burj Khalifa, 4 of the other top 20 tallest buildings in the world as well. Other work includes the GM Global Headquarters, the Beijing Finance Street, U.S. Census Bureau, the U.S. Air Force Academy, and the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, as well as numerous other significant and large projects. Luke, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to try to share my screen here.
Yeah, we do see your screen.
Yep. Okay. I'm going to get out of presentation mode. Does it look right? Okay. So I think today we heard from different people, from the building architecture to construction, to the wind, to the elevator. Finally, maybe we will look beyond the immediate to the future, maybe a few decades down the road even, to look at some of the issues we're going to have to resolve in sustainability. I don't think we need to tell you environment is an issue, but the point here is in 30 years, we're going to have to increase about 2 billion people on this planet. And it's going to be peaked out at about 11 billion people at the potentially end of this century. 50% more the population we have now. You really need to chew on that a little bit, because if you are in architecture school and if you're an architecture student, congratulations. Plenty of work for you, because United Nations projecting by the year 2060, we're going to need 2 times the built area of what we have right now. All right, we got a job for you. But in terms of environment, it may not be as positive in the sense that we're going to have to do something to accommodate all this growth of population and demand for housing, as majority of these people is going to live inside the city. But the impact extends well beyond the city. This is the world, 8,000 BC, a lot of virgin forests. This is the world today. The pink is not necessarily urban environment. The pink is actually agriculture land we need to support 7 billion people. The question for you, we have 50% more coming, 11 billion people by the end of this decade. How are we going to support them in terms of food? Because you look at, since we are, or at least, many of us are from Illinois, we know the change in Illinois, the land that we are familiar with. 8,000 before, 8,000 BC, this is the type of the original vegetation. This is Chicagoland and near Chicago to today. Majority converted into farmland. Not only that, those farmland, because they are exposed to the atmosphere, is the runoff of the nitrogen and phosphate into the Gulf of Mexico that create hypoxia, which you can see from the satellite. It actually looks like that in the Gulf of Mexico and destroy much of the marine life until the annual cycle to change the current and change the hypoxia phenomenon. So this is the problem in our backyard. Once you drive out of Chicago or drive outside the campus of UIUC, you see just miles and miles of farmland that are exposed to the atmosphere with no cover crop. And as a result, the nitrogen released to the atmosphere and the water body of Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico, they are in a way deserts. And by the way, only 5% of the farms in US are regenerative. 95% are not regenerative. How are we going to support 50% more population in the future? So as you can see, as architects and engineers, in the future, we are not just solving the urban environment issue. We are also solving the terrestrial issue. And those two things are linked together. That sort of flow into the farming issue is not just limited to the Gulf of Mexico. The hypoxia flow into the Gulf of Mexico, and the impact of that also flow into the tummy of you and I. Pre-industrial revolution, we have a circular food system that a lot of the nutrients go back to the food and go back to human. Today, we have a lot of chemical, fertilizer, pesticides, and other kinds of elements that disrupt that cycle. As a result, human beings, the gut microbe is very different. Well, how do we know that? If we push back in time to pre-industrial revolution, how did the people look like back then in the gut microbe? Well, we don't have a time tunnel, but we have the Amish people around us we can look at. And their gut microbe is very, very different than today's people's gut microbe. But they are a lot healthier than we do, because the gut microbe is really add up to the size of a mango. It controls our immune system, it digests our food, it helps our brain development, and it eliminates pathogen. In fact, a University of Oxford study linking the gut microbe to your personality. So if you think the world is changing recently, it may not be, sometimes it's not the world, sometimes it could be you. But the other times the world is actually changing, as in the gut microbe of the humans are changing, and their personality is also could be different. If you wonder why there are so much chronic diseases in recent days, from diabetes to all these issues, well, guess what? The recent studies suggest your gut microbe actually can create these diseases if they are not digesting your food correctly. So maybe one way to do that is transplant this gut microbe. Johns Hopkins University actually successfully used some of the microbes from one human that is healthy, transplanted to the other. And they suggest on their website, the cure rates could be over 90%. So as architects and engineers, we are not solving just an issue inside the building. We are solving a bigger issue within our realm of possibility. So net zero architecture is not enough. We got to go beyond that into buildings that can act more like a tree, help environment and people. So we suggest, now this is actually maybe an aspirational design, the idea of an urban sequoia to sequester carbon for a better environment and also create healthier food for people. So what is an urban sequoia? Urban sequoia is this building form that can optimize to reduce the carbon emission from where we are today to over 300% reduction in carbon. Now remember, this is a little bit aspirational. There's some science behind it, but there's also elements that beyond some of the possibility of today. So first, optimization of building form and also modularity. Okay, those are the first two things. And then the use of microbial, use of plants like algae to capture some of this carbon, and finally direct air capture of carbon dioxide. So optimization of building form, number one, we can roughly have 15% carbon reduction. Some of the speakers earlier talk about the beauty of certain shape. For example, a round shape tend to enclose a lot more volume with minimal amount of skin, and it could work better compared to a rectangular shape in terms of wind and etc. Second element is the modularity of the building components to minimize waste by construct this element away from the construction site and put them together to minimize waste. But I would like to focus a little bit more on the integration of these components to minimize the embodied carbon. Something you can see like this with precast panel that could be look aesthetically pleasing, but also functional. Now, this three technology that we're going to talk about next is actually the crust or the central core or the central suggestion of the urban sequoia. Number one is the biomaterial, transforming building from what we know of today to more bio-based material. Now we are using a lot of wood today. What if we have more bio-based material to create that carbon sequestration? In this case, it's bio bricks. It could be aggregate of bacteria with aggregate and water solution to form this biomaterial. They are not that difficult to do, by the way. Even kids can do it. And then we can create bio bricks, bio concrete, bio plastic to use our building as a carbon sink, just like a tree trunk. Modular element is always helpful to minimize waste. The second piece of this urban sequoia is about having the building to grow elements we need for the environment and for people. We pick algae because of the algae is a really fast growing element. So we can have bioelement with the sun and carbon capture to form algae. And the algae can create power, store the power as fuel, create food, and jet fuel and fuel for the ocean liner. Because one of the issues is even with electrification, we cannot solve is the fuel we need for the airplane and the containers, ocean liners. They need fuel that is not electric based today. So we still need sort of fuel for those elements, heating for the building, and also products for our buildings. So this is not new. Many buildings had considered algae as a facade before. So the final piece of this urban sequoia is active carbon sequestration, using the natural forces of tall building to go through carbon capture to take those carbon out of the atmosphere and create useful material for the building. So this is how it works. As the air flow through the filter of carbon dioxide, it actually captures the carbon from carbon dioxide and form useful material. So we can utilize the wind, very strong wind in terms of tall buildings as from stack effect or the horizontal wind because of the elevation. And then form this product from carbon as a food and beverage or building material or enhanced farming through the carbon we capture. So if we think this is maybe you haven't seen it yet in many of the building, well, guess what? This is from United Nations Secretary of Energy. She suggests we must deploy approaches such as emerging direct air carbon capture technology to address the issue, because the carbon issue is happening way too fast and we're not going to do it just through natural means alone. And she's suggesting we're going to invest money to do that, to do this carbon capture. So if you think, well, would this sort of technology happen? Well, 15 years ago, you know, they have similar question on, are we going to have PV farms? But as PV farms getting the momentum, they are applied to many of the buildings today. Now, we do not know whether carbon capture will be one of those vehicles, but we should certainly put an eye on the carbon capture and how fast we need to get to by 2040, 1.5 degrees C, which is 20 years away. Growing tree is not going to get us there. So could it be a carbon capture farms in our building utilizing our exhaust or our high wind speed of the tall buildings? Certainly there are projects we are proposing to do that in this building to get to net zero carbon in some of these tall buildings. This is how this different technology can be incorporated into an urban sequoia building, and how it actually could achieve that 300% carbon reduction in its life cycle through optimization of the form, modular construction, and use of the algae, and also the bio-based material, and then the carbon capture. This could be applied in the building industry. So this urban sequoia, just like a forest and the trees, they don't operate as an individual tree, they operate as a forest. So as a building industry, the urban sequoia can create material that can be used by the other buildings. So it acts like a forest, the transfer of material between different urban sequoias, create food source that could be shared, create agriculture inside our urban environment to minimize less the burden of our farms so that they can be more regenerative, and then create valuable biofuel for the airplanes and the ocean liners to able to power their journey and store energy. Because when in an all-electric world, a place like Illinois, we most likely we see dual peak. We'll peak our energy in the daytime summer, we'll peak our energy in the nighttime winter, and we're gonna need to store those energy for the times that are not peak to use, like the peak renewable energy generation, to store that energy for those times that are off-peak renewable energy generation. We know we can, if we do this sort of thinking, this is how much carbon we can save in 1 square kilometer of the city. So this, if it's applied to New York in an existing city, it could be like this. Maybe in Rio. And it could be the world. Think more, not individual building as a silo, but buildings as a community to share resources inside the district and around the world as trees and forests. We can save about 1.6 billion tons of carbon per year and change our farms to feed 11 billion people to a regenerative farming system, not the way we have right now that will erode the Illinois topsoil. In a few more decades, they're gonna be, much of the topsoil will be completely gone, and we will need a lot more fertilizer to our environment. We can change farms like this to regenerative farms like this for a better future to support the global growth in population. And also change our ecosystem from this to a healthier, less runoff environment. By the way, this is not just in America. If you look around the world, coastal hypoxia is a major environmental issue from farming all over the world. So the angle of urban sequoia could be healthier environment, healthier humanity. Thank you. And hopefully I save you some time for questions and panel discussion.
Yes, well done, Luke. Thank you. Let's see if we have any questions for Luke. Are there any questions in the audience here for Luke? Yes. I'm sorry, can you say that again, a little louder? So Luke, the question is how much would it cost currently, this the carbon sequestration technology from the air.
If you're talking about active carbon sequestration, it's actually about several $1,000 per a unit of 2 meter by 2 meter by 2 meter, and the embodied carbon is not significant, and 1 unit of energy will able to capture about 2 times the amount of carbon, but it's very preliminary.
Okay, anybody else in the audience? Okay, well, look, thank you again for excellent presentation. I learned something new every time I listen to it. So at this time, we're through our presentations. We'd like to start our panel discussion. So if I can invite our speakers to turn on their cameras. Javier, would you like to join us up here? So I'll get the ball rolling here with a couple topics. One, I want to start with Peter. You know, Peter, you talked a lot about what influences core design. You talked about efficiency of buildings with lease spans. One of the things that we've seen though with tall buildings is that in certain situations, and it's not all that uncommon, that the height is more influencing the shape than the program. And that is maybe we don't have as rigorous an efficiency, rigorous as an approach at getting focusing on lease spans to get our building shape. We may sacrifice lease spans in the effect of building for height and not for program, so to speak. Can you talk to that trend? Is that something that you see continuing?
Well, it was definitely, there was a period there where a lot of, and I'll preface it, most of my experiences in the Middle East and in China on super tall buildings. And both those parts of the world were certainly 10, 15, 20 years ago, were emerging and wanted to mark their emergence as world leading locations. And so I think you saw this proliferation of world's tallest buildings, and they 20 years ago they were in the United States, and since that time they're all in other parts of the world. And I think you're absolutely right. There was a real desire. Efficiency wasn't the purpose of doing the world's tallest building. The purpose of doing the world's tallest building was to show that Kuala Lumpur or Dubai or whatever, we're on the world map. Now, having said that, the other thing that the world's tallest building generally tends to do, or very tall building, doesn't have to be the world's tallest. It could be the tallest in a city. So, for instance, in Shanghai, the Pudong area, where Jin Mao was the first super tall built. And then since that time, you have the other pair of super talls right next to each other in this district. The creation of a focal point for a district became important. And the focal point was generally a very tall building, and it allowed the development with maybe much more efficient buildings around it to create a new urban center, so that was kind of that's the paradigm. And I think now, though, when you've seen it happen in China, where China is basically has clipped the height of buildings, maximizing at 475 or 500 meters by decree, just to kind of tampen down that enthusiasm and face it, wastefulness, because not every building has to be a super tall to be efficient. Matter of fact, probably most efficient buildings are a lot smaller than a super tall.
A lot of good points there. Thank you. We did just get a question from our audience. And again, this panel discussion is more about bringing up topics that may be interesting to everybody in attendance too. So please put some questions in the chat if you so desire. Okay, so the question here from our audience is for you, Luke. Based on the carbon impact of concrete, what is your position on the use of concrete in tall buildings going forward? Should we be developing shorter, denser cities to be more efficient to lower environmental impact? There might be a couple of you guys in that one.
I don't think, I think this is gonna be, everybody will have an opinion about it, but I can certainly tell you mine is we are looking at, you know, when you look at some of this more efficient, not at the city scale, we are not seeing the city scale, like we are, as you grow taller, right? Let's talk about embodied carbon alone. If the building is significantly tall, like a super tall building, 600-meter tall, the embodied carbon on structure per square meter is significantly higher than a mid-rise building, no doubt, right? And traditionally, we said the trade-off is using that to save the transportation. But what we are seeing right now is the transportation is not as, if it's all electric world, especially in certain cities like Xiong'an, we are designing, 90% of them are public. So it has it's changing that transportation parameter. And we are seeing one of the millennium city we designed in China, when we look at the efficiency, is around 10,000 people per kilometer. So the building height is only 200-300 meters, and it's not as tall, and the per square meter carbon from concrete is significantly lower. So we don't know whether that is for sure the trend, but we certainly seeing new information that inform design a little different than traditionally what we saw.
Okay.
Well, at this moment, just to add, you know, it depends on the structural system. For example, depending on the building type and what kind of material you use. Concrete is no longer the concrete that we know in the past. That's very highly dependent on cement. Right now, we're trying to avoid that and using more natural product to make it as a composite material and high strength, high stiffness, significant reduction in a concrete. Definitely, there's something that is ongoing. For example, if you take Burj Khalifa, the amount of concrete in that project is 0.53 meter cube per meter square. And if you look at a 20-story building nowadays using traditional construction, is probably 30% or 0.6 almost meter cube per meter square. So at this moment, I mean, you know, that is something that has to be kept in mind, and that's very much dependent on the structural system efficiency. So, and it is something to keep in mind. Obviously, you know, combination of steel and concrete, it is something that's there. And also what we have is for the floor framing using wood construction, potentially that's not necessarily in combination with a composite system. It is something that can be also used and minimize the amount of concrete and super tall.
No, those are all good points, Ahmed, and you know, to just further that a bit, there are certainly some carbon sequestering technologies that we can use in conventional construction. You know, some of the void slabs that we've looked at, and ways to utilize less concrete by providing a means for recycling some of our materials to get that extra depth in our structural slabs. In addition to all the composition of the concrete, as you've said. So next topic I have is, Nadir, this is for you. You know, you presented a number of interesting approaches to trying to solve how much space does the elevator take within the core. One technology you didn't touch on, though, and I know that is starting to have some potential for super tall and mega tall, is maybe a magnetic drive in the for the elevator, something that again, this is more I work with a ropeless, but how can you have a ropeless that approaches the speeds that that we need for our tall buildings? Is that something that's in the near future as well?
Well, the multi-system uses linear technology, which is magnet drive. And when we discuss about either the race of speed or the race of distribution, I mean, our belief is there is a limitation in the speed of the elevator. If you, let's say, we design elevators to transport quicker people to our destination. That should be the goal, why we need elevators. There is a limitation, which is typically physical limitation, which is 10 meters per second going up, 8 meters per second probably going down. If we do more than that, we need to start to think on pressurizing cabins, etc., because we start to have some discomfort, and we are going for these technologies, then that adds time to your destination. So there is an example we typically use, which is why having a Ferrari if we need to stop in every traffic light. So that's why when we were trying to look for technologies, we always thought in distribution, in efficiency, in semi-continuous system rather than speed. But the intelligent thing is here is combine the two needs. So high speed for sky lobbies, and then flexible for interfloor traffic. And that's why we believe, I mean, there are technologies with which we can reach 12, 16 meters, 18 meters per second, but that implies some other challenges. I mean, one of them, particularly going for tall, is ropes. Is ropes hitting shafts because of the building sway, or because we sometimes, speaking about efficiency, we are over 300 meters. We typically move much more mass than people. And to a certain extent, from our perspective, that is not fully efficient. So that's why for us it's more a balance between speed and flexibility. The other aspect I think we need to consider is the lifetime of the building. I think we discussed before about embodied carbon, but really where we are having the biggest impact is in the operation of the building. And when we are considering that building, we might design elevators with a lifetime of 20 years, but buildings for 50 or 100 that change the building configuration. So how is that impacting the way we are designing our transportation system? So that's why our core element goes more about flexibility rather than speed or even height. But we know we need to provide system for height, and that's why a linear system would be that might one of the technologies. Did I respond to your?
Yes, no, great, thank you. So the next question I had is for you, Ahmed. I know it's something we've talked about before, but one of the next advancements in construction that I see for tall buildings is there's been so many over the last couple of decades to really facilitate getting us to construct our tall buildings faster and faster. But I think there's a lot of potential for modular construction, and not only in terms of reducing the cycle time in terms of how long it takes to construct a building on a floor basis, but also in terms of increasing our quality control. Is there, I guess, I'm just looking for your thoughts on what do you see going forward here with modular constructions and the potential?
Well, yeah, it's a very good question, and I think pretty much as we move forward from this point on, globally, you can see that there's a significant reduction in the workforce. Second, safety and quality and environmental conditions become a major concern for everyone in the construction industry. So where we see the industry moving definitely is in a digital transformation, which means that right now we are in the middle of it, using utilization of BIM to transfer all the information from the designer hands all the way to the manufacturing, all the way through. But what is the next one is how do you use that information and transform it into construction, which means that we need to have a total transformation from the on-site work to off-site work. That means transfer everything into manufacturing. And for me, in the last few years, I've spent a bit of time on R&D related to that. It doesn't mean that every building needs to be square. It doesn't mean anything. It means from a design point of view, when we develop the structural system or building systems, everybody should be conscious and moving in one direction to design the building to be modular. And it doesn't mean you need to be limited to a shape or anything like that. It's just a matter of how you organize the space in such a way you move into that. And right now, I think whether it is 2D or 3D modular is being the trend that is going on. For example, in an office building, many people don't think of an office building being modular. But at the same time, if you think about the floor itself is where all the activities and all the work is being done. So the question is, how do we do that kind of work in which we got the steel, the structure, the mechanical system, the electrical system, the lighting, the floor finish, everything in one module as a sandwich, and deliver it as such in a 2D or 3D system. So I think where I see the industry is a digital transformation, which BIM plays a major role in design, and that this has to be done by everybody, moving in that direction, and then transferring that information into manufacturing to minimize the amount of work to be done on site. And that's where I see the next generation will be.
Just to point out maybe one of the potential advantages of doing modular in terms of reducing construction time. So Burj Khalifa.
Yeah, not only construction time, Jim, I think also safety and quality and environmental working.
Yeah, no,
sorry.
Those are to me there's a lot, modular construction is about a whole different methodology. It really is about producing a better product, a better coordinated product. I was just going to give the example in terms of how quick it takes or long it takes to build our buildings. The more tall buildings we're going to construct, it's a lot of effort. It's a long time that these buildings take to construct. Burj Khalifa took, as you know, Ahmed, 4 years to construct the structure, and we got down to a 3-day cycle on our quickest to construct floors, which you just can't do better if you're doing a cast in place structure. So part of our ability to realize structures even quicker and try to, the modular construction is about getting the construction, the quality, putting so much more emphasis on the manufacturing side, but it's about also saving the energy it takes to build the building. And right now we use a lot of energy. We use a lot of site logistics to build our tall buildings, and there's a way to reduce that with modular.
And definitely, I think mechanization of the entire construction process, it is something that the industry should be moving with. And there are systems that are being developed right now as we speak that could result in a significant time and cost saving, and also eliminate a lot of the temporary works that usually done on site that can be safety and as hazard stuff, and so we need to avoid all of that altogether. So definitely it is something we're moving in from design and construction industry in that direction.
So the next topic I have is for John. John, I know you talked in your presentation a lot about some strategies that are being taken, and how this is really part of a new design approach. And the quote you put from Bill Baker about how Burge was basically designed in the wind tunnel. You know, and when I came into the profession, the wind tunnel, and when you would frequently get brought into the project, was almost like a confirmation stage. It wasn't upfront in the design stage. How many projects would you say percentage-wise are you more on the concept design as opposed to being brought like schematic or design development? Are you seeing a significant increase?
There's definitely an increase. I think a lot of, particularly with tall buildings, there's a lot of the effort in front end loaded, I would say, because there's a realization that the time to realize this structure is much shorter today than it used to be. And so we need to think on our feet and do things quickly. Sometimes we get brought in at the concept stage to do a test just to establish a baseline. So where are we today? Where do we need to be in 6 or 8 weeks? And what do we need to know to improve what we've got? So we do a lot of work conceptually. Maybe I'll lead myself down an interesting direction, which is, you know, computational methods for looking at wind loads on structures. And people certainly ask, are there approaches we can use that are computational that would help us at the conceptual stage? And certainly are. You know, people are using CFD quite effectively, actually. It is useful. I would say use a little bit of caution, you know, when you're using computational methods. They're helpful to get an idea of relative improvements or relative changes. It's important to validate any of that computational work. And ASCE actually goes as far as saying you really shouldn't use computational methods for strength design or anything like that unless you've got validation studies to back it up. So I think the tools are improving. Every 10 years, somebody gets asked, you know, what's the status of computational methods? Well, they'll be much better in 10 years. And I've actually, you know, there was a time where I hadn't spent 10 years in the industry, but now that I've spent over 20, I can say I've heard similar conversations for a long time. But even at RWDI, we're using computational approaches. I know we've worked with SOM on projects where concepts are developed in CFD. SOM has actually gone as far as building their own wind tunnel to explore concepts at early stages and then bringing them to us for the SD or DD stages. So I think a lot of the effort's moving upstream.
Yeah, no, I was part of that effort to realize the tunnel at SOM, and it's a great design tool, but it's a preliminary tool for sure. To your point, you know, we still need to go through all the processes and the benefits of working with a proper tunnel technique like what you guys offer.